Some people think strength comes from money and power, but the truth is, real strength comes from knowing what's worth protecting. In the frontier town of Cold Creek, widow Clara Dawson found peace helping quiet mountain man Jacob Holt mend his cabin after losing her husband. But that peace ended when Silas Trent, a wealthy ranch owner, rode in demanding money Clara didn't owe. Jacob warned him to leave. Silas laughed and grabbed Clara's arm hard. The mountain man stepped forward from the shadows. When Silas reached for her again, Jacob put him on the ground with one move. As Silas begged for mercy, Jacob said quietly, "You laid hands on the wrong woman." What happened next would change everything in that small town. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, subscribe. Tomorrow I have something special waiting for you. Cold Creek wasn't much to look at, even by frontier standards. The town sat in a narrow valley where the mountains pressed close on three sides, as if the earth itself wanted to keep the place small and humble. One main street ran through the center, lined with weathered wooden buildings that had seen too many harsh winters. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith's forge, and a handful of other establishments made up the heart of the settlement. Beyond that, scattered homes and cabins dotted the hillsides, connected by worn paths that turned to mud every spring when the snow melted down from the peaks. It was 1881, and Montana Territory was still finding its way. The railroad hadn't reached Cold Creek yet, and likely never would. Stagecoaches came through twice a week, bringing mail and supplies, and the occasional stranger looking for land or escape. Most people who lived here had come for the latter, running from something or someone back east, hoping the distance and the mountains would be enough to bury the past. Clara Dawson had not come here to run. She'd been born in Cold Creek, the daughter of a schoolteacher who'd arrived with hopeful dreams of bringing education to the frontier. Her mother had died when Clara was 12, taken by fever one winter when the snow piled so high they couldn't reach the doctor in the next valley. Her father had followed 3 years later, his heart simply giving up one morning as he stood at the blackboard preparing the day's lessons. Clara had been 15, suddenly alone, suddenly responsible for herself in a place where survival required more than book learning. Thomas Dawson had saved her, though he'd never put it that way. He'd owned the general store, a quiet man 10 years her senior with gentle eyes and steady hands. He'd offered her work, sorting inventory and keeping his ledgers, and he'd never once made her feel like charity. Within a year, he'd asked her to marry him, not with poetry or grand gestures, but with simple honesty. "I'd be honored to take care of you, Clara," he'd said, "and I think maybe you could teach me to read better than I do." She'd said yes, and they'd built a good life together. 22 years of marriage, of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of small joys and smaller sorrows. They'd never had children. That grief was something Clara carried privately. But they'd had each other, and in a hard place like Cold Creek, that was more than many could claim. Thomas had been an honest man in a world that often rewarded dishonesty. He'd kept meticulous records in his leather-bound journal, documenting every transaction, every credit extended, every debt paid or forgiven. He'd refused to gouge customers during hard times, refused to water down supplies or shortchange waits. It had kept them comfortable but never wealthy, and Thomas had been content with that. "A man's word and his ledger ought to match," he'd say, running his finger down the neat columns of figures. "Otherwise, what's he worth?" 6 months ago, Thomas had been crossing the street when he'd seen a child wander into the path of a spooked horse, pulling a loaded freight wagon. He'd run without thinking, shoved the boy clear, and taken the impact himself. He died 3 hours later, holding Clara's hand, his last words a whispered apology for leaving her alone. The funeral had been well attended. Thomas had been respected, if not wealthy. The town had mourned with her, brought food and condolences, and then, as towns do, moved on with the business of living. Clara had been left with the small house they'd shared, a modest savings, and a grief so heavy some mornings she wasn't sure she could rise from bed. But she did rise. Every morning she rose, because Thomas would have expected nothing less, and because staying still meant drowning in sorrow. She'd sold the general store to Martha Hayes, a widow herself who'd been widowed young and knew something about carrying on. The money from the sale, combined with what Thomas had saved, was enough to live on if Clara was careful. She took in sewing and laundry work, kept herself busy, and tried not to think too much about the empty chair at her table. The mountains had always been a presence in Clara's life, but after Thomas died, she found herself looking at them differently. They were constant, unchanging, indifferent to human joy or sorrow. There was something comforting in that. The peaks didn't care about her grief, didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward sympathy. They simply stood patient and eternal. It was the mountains that had led her to Jacob Holt in a way, or perhaps it was Providence, though Clara had complicated feelings about Providence these days. She'd been walking one afternoon in early spring, following a trail that wound up through the pine forest above town. She'd needed to move, to breathe air that didn't smell like the house she'd shared with Thomas. The snow was melting, revealing last autumn's fallen needles and the first tentative shoots of new growth. She'd walked farther than intended, lost in thought, and when she'd finally turned back, the sun was lower than she'd realized. That's when she'd seen the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, built solid from logs chinked with moss and mud. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and a decent garden plot had been cleared and fenced nearby. She'd heard of the mountain man who lived up here. Everyone in Cold Creek had. Jacob Holt, they called him, though few knew much more than his name. He came to town once a month or so, traded furs and game for supplies, spoke to no one more than necessary, and disappeared back into the high country. Rumors swirled, the way they do about solitary men. Some said he was hiding from the law. Others claimed he'd gone mad after some tragedy back east. A few of the older residents remembered when he'd first arrived, maybe 15 years ago, and said he'd been different then, younger, haunted but not unfriendly. Time and isolation had made him into something else, a ghost who walked among them but belonged to the wilderness. Clara had stood at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to call out or slip away quietly. Before she could decide, the cabin door had opened. The man who emerged was tall and lean, wearing buckskin pants and a worn flannel shirt. His hair was long, tied back, streaked with gray, though he couldn't have been much past 50. His face was weathered, lined from sun and wind, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the color of winter ice. "You're lost," he'd said. Not a question, just a statement of fact. "I walked farther than I meant to," Clara had replied, lifting her chin slightly. She'd never been one to show fear, even when she felt it. "I know the way back. Be dark before you make it to town." He'd studied her for a moment, taking in her widow's black dress, her worn boots, the weariness in her face. "Storm coming in tonight. Can smell it." He'd been right, as she'd later learned he usually was about such things. The sky had been clear, but within an hour clouds had rolled over the peaks, and by nightfall Cold Creek was buried in a late spring snow squall. Jacob had offered her shelter with no ceremony. He gestured to the cabin, said, "You can wait it out here," and that had been that. The interior was simple but well kept. A rope bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, a stone hearth that radiated warmth. He'd given her the bed without discussion, made himself a pallet on the floor, and they'd passed the evening in near silence, broken only by the storm howling outside. In the morning, when the snow had stopped and the world lay white and clean, Jacob had walked her back to town. They'd barely spoken, but something had shifted. Perhaps it was simply 2 lonely people recognizing something in each other. Perhaps it was the memory of unexpected kindness in a world that often offered none. The following week, Clara had walked back up the mountain trail. She'd brought fresh bread and asked bluntly if he needed any help with anything. Jacob had looked at her for a long moment, then nodded toward his cabin. "Roof's got some weak spots," he'd said. "Could use an extra pair of hands." That had been the beginning. Once or twice a week, Clara made the climb to Jacob's clearing. She helped with repairs, tended the garden, sometimes just sat on the porch and sewed, while Jacob worked on tanning hides or carving snowshoes for the coming winter. He paid her in venison and elk. In firewood he'd cut and hauled down to her house in town, in the quiet companionship of someone who understood that grief didn't need to be discussed to be shared. They spoke little, but what they said mattered. Jacob told her, eventually, that he'd been a scout in the army, that he'd seen things in the war that still visited him in dreams. Clara told him about Thomas, about the emptiness of a house that had been full of small daily joys. Neither offered solutions or comfort beyond presence. It was enough. The people of Cold Creek watched this unlikely friendship with curiosity but little judgment. Martha Hayes told Clara she thought it was good for her to have purpose again. Sheriff Ben Cartwright, a fair-minded man in his 60s who'd known Clara since she was a girl, mentioned that Jacob Holt seemed less like a ghost and more like a man these days, and he figured Clara had something to do with that. There was one person who did not approve. Silas Trent had built his ranch empire in the valley below Cold Creek, buying up land and water rights, running cattle and horses across thousands of acres. He'd been Thomas's business partner in a few ventures over the years, though Thomas had always been cautious about those dealings. Silas had a reputation, earned honestly, for being ruthless in business and careless with people who got in his way. He was also a man who'd decided some years back that Clara Dawson would make a suitable wife. He'd never actually proposed, but he'd made his interest clear in the way powerful men do, with meaningful looks and suggestions that she must be lonely, that a woman needed protection and provision. Thomas had been alive then, and his quiet presence had been answer enough. After Thomas died, Silas had waited a respectful 3 months before making his first visit, bringing flowers and condolences and an offer to help with anything she might need. Clara had thanked him politely and sent him away. He'd returned twice more, each time more insistent. The third time, Clara had been direct. "Mr. Trent, I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing fine on my own. I'm not looking for a husband, and if I were, I'd do my own looking." Silas hadn't appreciated the rejection. Men like him rarely did. He'd left with a tight smile and a warning disguised as friendly advice. "Cold Creek can be hard on a woman alone, Clara. You do well to remember who your friends are." That had been 2 months ago. Since then, Silas had kept his distance, but Clara sometimes felt his eyes on her when she saw him in town. There was something calculating in his gaze, something that made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite name. She'd mentioned it once to Jacob carefully while they were replacing rotted boards on his front porch. Jacob had paused in his work, looked down at the valley where Silas's ranch sprawled across the lowlands, and said simply, "Some men think everything's for sale if they offer enough. Those men don't like being told no. Should I be worried?" Clara had asked. Jacob had met her eyes then, and there'd been something in his expression that reminded her he'd been a soldier once. "Not while I'm breathing," he'd said, and gone back to hammering nails. It was a promise she'd held on to, though she hadn't truly believed she'd need it. Silas Trent was arrogant and presumptuous, but he was a businessman, not a brigand. He worked within the law, however loosely he interpreted it. She'd been wrong about that, as she was about to discover. The day it all changed had been ordinary in every way. Spring was fully arrived, the mountain meadows blooming with wildflowers, the air sweet with pine and warming earth. Clara had walked up to Jacob's cabin in the morning, carrying bread and a jar of the preserves Martha had given her. Jacob had been working on his fence line, and she'd helped him stretch wire and pound posts until noon. They'd eaten a simple lunch, bread, cheese, cold venison, sitting on the porch and watching a hawk circle lazy patterns against the blue sky. It was peaceful, the kind of peace Clara had learned to value after so much loss. She'd felt, for the first time in months, something like contentment. Then she'd heard horses approaching through the trees. 3 riders emerged into the clearing, Silas Trent in the lead on a fine bay gelding. Behind him rode 2 of his ranch hands, both armed with rifles across their saddles. Clara had stood slowly, her heart beginning to pound. Jacob had risen beside her, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "Clara," Silas had said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I'd hoped to find you in town, but Martha said you'd come up here. Saves me a trip, I suppose." His smile didn't reach his eyes as he glanced at Jacob. "Good afternoon, Holt." Jacob had nodded once, said nothing. "What do you want, Silas?" Clara had kept her voice steady. Silas had dismounted, pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "I've come on business, I'm afraid. Unpleasant business, but it can't be avoided any longer." He'd held out the paper. "This is a promissory note signed by your late husband. He owed me $500 from a business loan. I've been patient, given your circumstances, but the matter needs to be settled." Clara's hands had gone cold as she took the paper. She'd unfolded it, stared at what appeared to be Thomas's signature at the bottom of a document promising payment to Silas Trent for money borrowed. "This is a lie," she'd said quietly. "Thomas never borrowed money from you. He kept records of every transaction. This is a forgery." Silas's expression had hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Clara. I have the note properly signed. Your husband's financial difficulties are a matter of record. Thomas had no financial difficulties. His books were immaculate. Books can be altered." Silas had stepped closer, his voice taking on an edge. "I'm being generous, Clara. I'm giving you time to pay. But that house you're living in, that money from the store, that's mine until the debt is satisfied." "You're lying." Clara had felt the rage building, hot and righteous. Thomas was weak," Silas had snapped. "He was a fool who didn't know how to capitalize on opportunities. And now you're just as foolish, taking up with this hermit." He gestured dismissively at Jacob. "When you could have had security, respect." That's when Clara had understood. This wasn't about money. This was about rejection, about power, about a man who couldn't tolerate being refused. "Leave," she'd said. "Get off this property and don't come back." Silas had laughed then, an ugly sound. "This isn't his property, Clara. This is public land. Just like you're going to find that house of yours isn't your property much longer." He'd moved toward her, reaching for her arm. "You need to learn—" That's when Jacob had spoken. His voice had been quiet, but it carried weight. "The lady asked you to leave." Silas had turned, his face flushing with anger and something else. Contempt, perhaps, or the particular offense a wealthy man feels when challenged by someone he considers beneath him. "This doesn't concern you, Holt. I'm conducting business with Mrs. Dawson. Why don't you go back to your traps and pelts and let civilized people handle civilized matters?" Jacob hadn't moved from where he stood beside Clara on the porch, but something in his stillness changed. It was subtle, the kind of shift a prey animal might notice right before a predator strikes. His shoulders settled, his weight redistributed almost imperceptibly, and his eyes, those winter ice eyes, fixed on Silas with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. "I'll ask you once more," Jacob said, his voice even quieter than before. "Leave." Silas had laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Oh, what? You'll do what, exactly?" He'd taken another step toward Clara, his hand reaching for her arm again. "Clara, be reasonable. I'm offering you a way out of this. Come back to town with me, we'll discuss terms like adults." "Don't touch her," Jacob said. But Silas had already grabbed Clara's arm, his fingers digging into her sleeve, pulling her toward him. "You need to understand your position here." Clara had tried to pull away, but Silas's grip tightened. She saw his face up close, saw the anger and wounded pride twisted into something uglier, something that made her stomach turn with genuine fear for the first time. "Let me go," she said firmly, but he held on. "You think you're too good for me?" Silas hissed, his voice low enough that his men couldn't hear. "A shopkeeper's widow playing house with a mountain savage? You're nothing, Clara, nothing without protection, without money, without—" He didn't finish. Jacob had moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age, crossing the distance between them in 2 strides. One hand clamped on Silas's wrist, breaking his grip on Clara with surgical precision. The other hand, open-palmed, controlled, struck Silas in the center of his chest, right at the solar plexus. The air exploded from Silas's lungs in a whoosh. His legs buckled, and he went down hard, landing on his knees in the dirt of the clearing, gasping like a landed fish. His hat tumbled off, rolled a few feet away. For several long seconds, he couldn't draw breath, couldn't speak, could only kneel there with his mouth open and his face reddening. The two ranch hands had tensed, hands moving toward their rifles, but Jacob had already turned to face them. He hadn't drawn a weapon, didn't appear to be carrying one, but something in his posture, in the absolute calm of his expression, made both men freeze. "You want to be part of this?" Jacob asked mildly. The hands exchanged glances. Neither man moved for their rifles. The older of the two, a weathered cowboy named Pete, who Clara recognized from town, slowly raised his hands away from his weapon. "No trouble from us, Holt. We just work for the man." "Then help him back on his horse," Jacob said, "and take him home." Silas had finally managed to draw a ragged breath, then another. Color was returning to his face, but now it was the red of humiliation and rage rather than oxygen deprivation. He looked up at Jacob from his knees, and Clara saw something flicker across his features, genuine fear, quickly masked but unmistakable. "You," Silas gasped, "you struck me. You assaulted—" "I stopped you from assaulting her," Jacob corrected, his voice still quiet. "There's a difference. Sheriff will see it that way too if you want to make an official complaint." Silas pushed himself to his feet, unsteady, his fine clothes now covered in dust. His eyes darted from Jacob to Clara and back again, calculating, reassessing. The two ranch hands had dismounted and moved to flank him, ready to steady him if needed. "This isn't over," Silas said, trying to recover some dignity. "That note is legal and binding. I'll have what I'm owed, Clara, one way or another." He turned his gaze to Jacob, and the look was pure venom. "And you, interfering with legal business, assaulting a property owner, you just made a very serious mistake." Jacob said nothing. He simply stood there, positioned slightly in front of Clara, his hands loose at his sides. Silas snatched his hat from the dirt, jammed it back on his head. "Pete, help me mount." The older ranch hand moved to assist, and Silas climbed back onto his gelding with less grace than he'd arrived with. From horseback, he looked down at Clara one more time. "You have 1 week to come to your senses and settle this debt properly. After that, I'll be forced to take legal action. Your house, your possessions, all of it will be seized to satisfy what's owed." "There is no debt," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. "And you know it." "Prove it," Silas shot back. "Bring your evidence to Judge Morrison. Let him decide who's telling the truth, a respected businessman or a grieving widow who's taken leave of her senses." He jerked his reins, turning his horse. "Let's go." The three riders departed the clearing at a trot, heading back down the mountain trail. Clara and Jacob stood in silence until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely into the forest. Then Clara's knees went weak, and she sat down hard on the porch step. "Are you hurt?" Jacob asked, kneeling beside her. His hand hovered near her arm, where Silas had grabbed her, but he didn't touch without permission. "No," Clara managed. "Just shaken." She looked at the paper still clutched in her hand, the forged promissory note. "Jacob, this is a lie. Thomas never borrowed money from anyone. He was so proud of that. He said debt was a chain, and he'd rather do without than be bound." "I believe you," Jacob said simply. "Judge Morrison won't. He's been in Silas's pocket for years. Everyone knows it, but no one says it out loud." Clara felt tears of frustration and fear burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Silas will take everything. My home, the little money I have left. He'll destroy Thomas's reputation, make him look like a failure and a debtor. And there's nothing I can do to stop it." Jacob was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the trail where Silas had disappeared. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight Clara had never heard before. "There's always something that can be done. Question is whether you're willing to do it." Clara looked at him, this quiet man who'd become her friend, her ally in grief. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we find proof that note's a forgery. We find out what Silas is really after and why. We make it so he can't take what isn't his." Jacob met her eyes. "But it won't be easy, and it might be dangerous. Men like Silas Trent don't like being challenged, especially not by women and mountain hermits." "You could stay out of it," Clara said softly. "This isn't your fight." Jacob shook his head slowly. "He put his hands on you. Made it my fight the second he did that." He stood, offered her his hand. "Come on, Let's get you back to town before dark. Tomorrow we start figuring out what to do about this." Clara took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the clearing in golden light. Everything looked peaceful, beautiful even, but Clara could feel how quickly things had changed. An hour ago she'd been content, almost happy. Now she stood on the edge of something dark and uncertain. "Jacob," she said as they started down the trail, "thank you for what you did." "Nothing to thank me for," he replied. "Just did what anyone should do." But they both knew that wasn't true. In Cold Creek, as in most frontier towns, power and money bought silence and compliance. Silas Trent was used to getting his way, used to people stepping aside or looking down when he walked past. Jacob Holt had done neither, and that made him either very brave or very foolish. As they walked through the darkening forest, Clara turned her mind to practical matters. She needed Thomas's journal, the one where he'd kept every financial record for the past 20 years. It was in her house, locked in the desk drawer where he'd always kept it. That journal would prove no debt existed. It had to. But even as she thought it, a cold dread settled in her stomach. If Silas had gone to the trouble of forging a promissory note, what else might he do? Would he try to forge entries in Thomas's journal? Would he claim the journal itself was falsified? "I need to get Thomas's records somewhere safe," she said suddenly. "If Silas gets his hands on them, bring them to me," Jacob said without hesitation. "Tomorrow, bring anything you can't afford to lose. I'll keep it safe." He could search your cabin. He could try. There was something in Jacob's tone that suggested that would not go well for anyone who attempted it. "Clara, I know we haven't known each other long, but I'm asking you to trust me. Can you do that?" Clara thought about the past months, about the quiet companionship and unspoken understanding, about the way Jacob had stepped between her and Silas without a moment's hesitation. "Yes," she said, "I trust you." They reached the edge of town as the last light faded from the sky. Jacob walked her to her front door, waited until she was safely inside, then tipped his hat and disappeared back into the darkness. Clara stood in her empty house, the forged promissory note still in her hand, and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. Silas Trent had declared war, even if he dressed it up in legal language and false civility. He wanted her property, her surrender, her acknowledgement that he held the power and she held nothing. The question was why? Yes, she'd rejected his advances, but this seemed excessive even for wounded male pride. What was he really after? Clara lit a lamp, sat down at Thomas's desk and pulled out his journal. She ran her fingers over the leather cover, worn smooth from years of handling. Inside were pages of Thomas's neat handwriting, careful columns of figures, notes about credit extended and repaid, records of sales and purchases. It was the documentation of an honest man's honest work, and it was the only weapon she had against Silas's lies. She would take it to Jacob tomorrow, along with her other important papers, the deed to the house, her marriage certificate, Thomas's death certificate. She would put them in the hands of a man she'd known for only a few months, but trusted more than most she'd known for years. And then they would figure out how to fight back against a man who owned half the valley and had the law in his pocket. Clara closed the journal, held it against her chest for a moment. "Help me, Thomas," she whispered to the empty room. "Help me protect what we built. Help me prove the truth." No answer came, of course. The dead don't speak, no matter how much we wish they would. But Clara felt something shift inside her, something that felt almost like strength, or perhaps just the stubbornness that had kept her going after her parents died, after Thomas died, after every loss and hardship this hard land had thrown at her. She would not give up. She would not surrender to Silas's threats and manipulations. Thomas had been an honest man, and she would honor that honesty by fighting for the truth, no matter what it cost. Outside, Cold Creek settled into its evening rhythms. Lamps flickered in windows. The saloon piano started its nightly repertoire of familiar tunes. Horses shifted in stables, and somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. The mountains stood dark against the stars, indifferent and eternal, keeping their secrets as they always had. But in one small house on the edge of town, a widow made a decision that would change everything. She would stand and fight, and she would not stand alone. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of spring morning where you could see your breath but feel the promise of warmth in the sun's first rays. Clara had barely slept, her mind turning over possibilities and problems until exhaustion finally dragged her under near dawn. She woke with the sunrise, made coffee, and began gathering the documents she needed to take to Jacob. Thomas's journal went into a canvas bag, along with the deed to the house, their marriage certificate, and a sheaf of letters from Thomas's correspondence with various suppliers and merchants over the years. She added her mother's cameo brooch, her father's pocket watch, and the simple gold wedding band she wore on her left hand. No, not the ring. She couldn't bear to take that off, not yet. It stayed on her finger where it belonged. She was just fastening the bag when someone knocked on her door. Clara's heart jumped, fear flashing through her before she forced herself calm. It wouldn't be Silas. He'd given her a week, and he was too calculating to make his next move so soon. She opened the door to find Sheriff Ben Cartwright standing on her porch, hat in his hands. His weathered face was troubled, and Clara's stomach dropped. "Ben," she said. "What's wrong?" "Morning, Clara," he said, his voice gentle. "Mind if I come in? Need to talk to you about something." She stepped aside, let him enter. The sheriff was a good man, fair-minded and honest, but he was also practical. He knew where the power lay in Cold Creek, and he knew the limits of what he could do against someone like Silas Trent. "I heard about what happened yesterday," Ben said, turning his hat in his hands. "Up at Holt's place. That was fast," Clara said. "Let me guess. Silas came to see you last night, late." Ben sighed, moved to the window, looked out at the quiet street. "He's claiming Jacob assaulted him. Says he went up there on legitimate business, trying to collect a legal debt, and Holt attacked him without provocation." "That's a lie," Clara said flatly. "Silas grabbed me first. Jacob stopped him. That's all." "I believe you," Ben said, and Clara felt a small measure of relief. "Problem is, Silas has 2 witnesses who'll swear otherwise. His ranch hands will say whatever he tells them to say. And he's already been to Judge Morrison, got himself a restraining order against Jacob. Holt comes within 100 yards of Silas or his property, he'll be arrested." Clara felt the walls closing in. "Ben, that promissory note Silas showed me, it's a forgery. Thomas never borrowed money from him. I have Thomas's journal, every financial transaction documented. There's no record of any loan." Ben nodded slowly. "I figured as much. Thomas Dawson was the most meticulous man I ever knew. But Clara," he turned to face her, his expression pained, "Judge Morrison isn't going to take your word over Silas's, even with the journal. Silas will claim Thomas kept a separate set of books, or forgot to record it, or some damn thing. You'd know how it works. So he just wins." Clara heard the bitterness in her own voice. "He forges a document, threatens me, and gets away with it because he has money and influence?" "I didn't say that." Ben put his hat on, settled it carefully. "I'm saying you need to be smart about this. Don't confront him directly. Don't give him ammunition to use against you. And tell Jacob Holt to stay clear. I respect what he did, protecting you, but if he violates that restraining order, I'll have no choice but to lock him up. That's the law." "The law," Clara repeated hollowly. "What good is the law when men like Silas can buy it?" "Not all of us are for sale," Ben said quietly. "Remember that. And Clara," he paused at the door, "be careful. I've known Silas Trent for 20 years. He's ruthless, but he's usually content to work within the system, bend the rules, rather than break them. This thing with you, this vendetta, it's different. More personal. That makes him more dangerous." After Ben left, Clara stood in her small parlor, feeling the weight of helplessness. But no, that wasn't quite right. Not helplessness. Anger. A hot, righteous anger that burned away the fear and left something harder in its place. She picked up the canvas bag with Thomas's journal and her precious documents. She locked her door behind her and started up the mountain trail toward Jacob's cabin. The morning sun warmed her back, and with each step her resolve strengthened. Silas Trent thought he could use the law as a weapon against her. He thought his money and his influence made him untouchable. He'd forgotten one crucial truth that every frontier town eventually learned. The law only works when good people believe in it. When that belief dies, when people see justice as something that can be bought and sold, other kinds of justice emerge. Clara wasn't thinking about violence or revenge. She was thinking about truth, about evidence, about finding a way to expose Silas's corruption, not just to a compromised judge, but to the entire town. Cold Creek was small enough that reputation still mattered, that public opinion could ruin a man as surely as any court verdict. She reached Jacob's clearing to find him splitting wood, his axe rising and falling with practiced rhythm. He stopped when he saw her, buried the axe in the chopping block, and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Thought you might come this morning," he said. "Heard Silas got a restraining order. How did you—" "Martha Hayes' nephew delivers telegrams. Stopped by on his rounds, thought I should know." Jacob nodded toward the cabin. "Let's get those papers put away safe." Inside, Jacob showed her a loose floorboard under his bed where he'd created a hidden cache. "Used to keep money here back when I first arrived. Now it's mostly empty. Your things will be safe." Clara watched him place the canvas bag carefully in the space beneath the floor, replace the board, and cover it with a woven rug. "Thank you," she said. "Ben Cartwright came to see me this morning. He said I need to be careful, that Silas is more dangerous than usual." "Ben's right." Jacob moved to put water on for coffee. "Which means we need to be smarter. Can't fight Silas head-on, not yet. Need to understand what he's really after first. My house and property, obviously. Maybe." Jacob handed her a tin cup of coffee once it had boiled. "But there's usually more to it with men like him. $500 isn't enough to go to this much trouble, not for someone with Silas's money. There's something else, something about your property or your position that he wants. We figure out what that is, we might find a way to stop him." Clara sipped the bitter coffee, let its warmth spread through her. "Where do we start?" "We start by finding out if you're the only one," Jacob said. "If Silas has done this before, used fake debts to steal property from people who couldn't fight back. A pattern like that, that's something even a crooked judge might have to answer for." It made sense. Clara felt the first stirring of hope. Martha might know. She hears everything that happens in town. "Then that's where we start." Jacob met her eyes. "But Clara, you need to understand. Once we start pulling on this thread, Silas is going to fight back. Harder than before. You sure you want to do this?" Clara thought about Thomas, about his honesty, and his pride in living a life above reproach. She thought about her small house, the life she'd built, the memory she was trying to protect. And she thought about Silas Trent's hand on her arm, the assumption that he could take whatever he wanted because he had the power and she had none. "I'm sure," she said. Jacob nodded slowly, something like respect in his winter ice eyes. "All right then, let's go to war." The walk back to Cold Creek felt different than any Clara had taken before. She'd walked this trail dozens of times now, in sun and rain, in the cool of morning and the warmth of afternoon. But today, with Jacob beside her and a purpose forming in her mind, every step felt weighted with meaning. They weren't just going to town. They were beginning something that would change everything, for better or worse. The mountain trail descended through tall pines, their needles carpeting the path with soft amber cushion that muffled footsteps. A creek ran parallel to the trail, swollen with snowmelt, rushing over stones with a sound like constant conversation. Birds called from the branches, jays and ravens mostly, their voices harsh and knowing in a way that made Clara think they understood more than birds should. Jacob walked slightly ahead, his steps sure and quiet. He'd left his buckskins for town clothes, wool trousers and a cotton shirt, a leather vest that had seen better years. But even dressed like a townsman, he moved like someone more comfortable in wilderness, his attention constantly scanning the forest around them, noting things Clara couldn't see. "You always this watchful?" she asked. "Old habits," Jacob said without turning. "Spent too many years scouting where inattention meant death. Can't shut it off now, even if I wanted to. Must be exhausting, always looking for danger. Less exhausting than being caught unaware." He paused at a bend in the trail where the trees opened up to give a view of the valley below. Cold Creek was visible from here, its buildings small as a child's toys, scattered in the narrow valley. Beyond, the grasslands stretched toward Silas Trent's ranch, thousands of acres marked by fence lines and distant cattle. "How much land does he own?" Clara asked, following Jacob's gaze. "Near about 15,000 acres, last I heard. Controls most of the good water in the valley, too. Bought up rights from homesteaders, some legitimate, some less so." Jacob's voice was neutral, but Clara heard the judgment underneath. "Man builds an empire like that, he gets used to having his way. Folks depend on him for work, for water rights, for credit at his company store. Or to stand up to someone who controls whether you eat or not. Is that what he's counting on? That no one will help me because they're afraid of him?" "Partly." Jacob started walking again. "But people are more complicated than just fear. Some will help because it's right. Some won't help even though they know it's right. And some," he glanced back at her, "some are just waiting to see which way the wind blows before they choose a side." They reached the edge of town just as the morning was shifting toward noon. The main street was moderately busy. Wagons unloading supplies at the general store, horses tied at the saloon's hitching rail, a handful of people going about their daily business. Clara felt eyes turn toward them as they walked together toward Martha Hayes' store. She could almost hear the whispers starting, the speculation about the widow and the mountain man. Let them talk, she thought. She'd lived in Cold Creek her entire life, and she was done worrying about what people thought. Martha's general store occupied the largest building on Main Street, a two-story structure with living quarters upstairs and the commercial space below. Martha had bought it from Clara 6 months ago, paying a fair price and promising to maintain the standards Thomas had set. She'd kept that promise and then some. The store was clean, well-stocked, and Martha treated every customer with the same respect regardless of their ability to pay immediately. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Martha was behind the counter helping a farmer's wife with fabric selection. She looked up, saw Clara and Jacob, and something flickered across her face. Concern, maybe, or recognition that their presence together meant something significant. "Be with you in a moment," Martha called, turning back to her customer. Clara and Jacob waited near the pot-bellied stove, pretending to examine a display of farming implements while Martha finished her transaction. The farmer's wife left with her purchases, and only then did Martha flip the sign on the door to closed and pull the shade down. "All right," Martha said, crossing her arms. "What's happened?" "And don't tell me nothing, because the whole town's buzzing about Silas Trent and his confrontation with you two yesterday." Clara glanced at Jacob, who nodded slightly. She pulled out the forged promissory note, handed it to Martha. "Silas claims Thomas owed him $500. This is his proof." Martha unfolded the paper, studied it carefully. She'd been a banker's wife back east before coming to Montana, and she knew documents. "The signature looks right," she said slowly, "but something's off about the paper itself. Too clean, too new. If Thomas signed this years ago, it should show more wear." She looked up at Clara. "You're saying it's a forgery?" "I know it is. Thomas never borrowed money from anyone. He kept meticulous records. There's no mention of any loan to Silas in his journal." Martha handed the paper back, her expression grim. "That journal won't matter to Judge Morrison. Silas has been contributing to the judge's election campaigns for years. You could have God himself testify, and Morrison would still rule in Silas's favor. That's what Sheriff Cartwright said." Clara tucked the paper away. "Martha, we need to know if Silas has done this before. Used fake debts to steal property from people who couldn't fight back. If there's a pattern—" "There is," Martha said flatly. She moved to the stove, poured 3 cups of coffee from the pot that sat perpetually warming there. "I didn't want to believe it at first. Seemed too calculated, too cruel. But I've been here long enough to see it happen 3 times that I know of." Jacob accepted a cup, took a careful sip. "Tell us." Martha settled onto a stool behind the counter, cradled her coffee in both hands. "First was about 8 years ago. Widow named Elizabeth Porter, married to Samuel Porter's son. Young thing, barely 20, with a baby. Her husband died in a mining accident, and Silas came calling with a debt claim. She couldn't prove otherwise, couldn't afford a lawyer. Lost her house, moved back east with her family in disgrace. Samuel was devastated. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. Samuel Porter, the elderly rancher up near Copper Ridge. That's him. He's never forgiven Silas, but he's one old man against an empire. What could he do? Martha sipped her coffee. Second was a homesteader family, the Johnsons. Nice people, worked hard, were just starting to make their land pay. Silas showed up with a claim that the father had borrowed money for seed and equipment. The father swore it was a lie, but same story. Judge Morrison ruled in Silas's favor. They lost everything, packed up, and left Montana entirely. And the third? Jacob asked. Last year, man named Robert Chen ran a freight business. Chinese immigrant, worked himself half to death building up his operation. Silas claimed Chen owed him for business loans. Chen had records proving otherwise, but Martha's voice went hard. Judge Morrison said a Chinaman's records couldn't be trusted. Ruled for Silas. Chen sold what was left of his business and disappeared. No one knows where he went. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of those destroyed lives hanging in the air. Clara thought about Elizabeth Porter, about the Johnson family, about Robert Chen, different people, different circumstances, but all of them vulnerable in some way. All of them unable to defend themselves against a powerful man with a corrupt judge in his pocket. There's a pattern, Jacob said quietly. Widows, immigrants, small operators without family or connections to protect them. Silas picks targets who can't fight back effectively, and targets whose property he wants for some reason, Clara added. She looked at Martha. Do you know what Silas gained from each of those cases? Why those properties specifically? Martha thought for a moment. Elizabeth Porter's house was on the edge of town, right where the main road turns toward the valley. Good location for a business. Silas tore it down, built a warehouse there. The Johnson homestead had water rights to a creek that flows through Silas's land. And Robert Chen's freight business that gave Silas control of shipping in and out of Cold Creek. He owns the only freight operation now, can charge whatever he wants. So it's not just about cruelty, Clara said slowly, working through it. It's strategic. He's consolidating power, eliminating competition, securing resources he needs. Which means, Jacob said, your property has something he wants. Question is what? Clara thought about her small house, the quarter-acre it sat on. Nothing special about the location that she could see. No water rights, no particular business advantage. Unless the railroad, she said suddenly. There's been talk for years about bringing a spur line to Cold Creek. Thomas and I were at a town meeting 2 years ago where they discussed possible routes. One of the proposed lines would have come right through where my house sits. Martha's eyes widened. That's it. That has to be it. If the railroad comes through, property values along the route will skyrocket. Silas wants to own every parcel the railroad might need, so he can negotiate the price. Your house is probably one of the last pieces he needs. Jacob set his cup down with a decisive clink. So we need to find the others. Elizabeth Porter, the Johnsons if we can reach them. And we definitely need to talk to Samuel Porter. If we can get them to testify about what Silas did to them. They won't, Martha interrupted. I've tried talking to Samuel about it. He's too afraid. Says Silas will finish destroying what little he has left if he speaks up. And the others are long gone. Elizabeth's family won't let her anywhere near Montana, and the Johnsons could be anywhere by now. Clara felt frustration rising. So we know Silas is guilty of multiple frauds. We know there's a pattern, but we can't prove it because his victims are too frightened or too scattered? Not quite, Jacob said thoughtfully. We can't prove the other cases, but we can prove yours. You have Thomas's journal. You have your own testimony. And you have me as a witness to what happened yesterday. How Silas assaulted you, how he threatened you. Judge Morrison won't care, Clara said bitterly. Maybe not. But the people of this town will. Jacob stood, paced to the window, looked out at the street beyond. Martha, you said the whole town is talking. Let them talk. Let everyone know what Silas is doing. Make it public, make it impossible to ignore. Even a corrupt judge has to think twice when the entire community is watching. Martha was nodding slowly. A sort of trial by public opinion. Force the truth out into the open where everyone can see it. Exactly, Jacob said. And we document everything. Every threat Silas makes, every move he takes against Clara, we record it, we tell people. We make sure his actions can't be hidden or explained away. It was a good strategy, Clara had to admit, but it required something she wasn't sure she had. The courage to make herself even more vulnerable, more exposed, in the hope that her neighbors would stand with her rather than look away. What if they don't help? She asked quietly. What if people are too afraid of Silas, or they don't believe me, or they just don't care enough to get involved? Jacob turned from the window, met her eyes with that steady winter gaze. Then we'll know where we stand, and we'll figure out the next move. But Clara, I don't think that's going to happen. People in Cold Creek knew Thomas. They know you. They know you're not a liar or a cheat. And most people, when they see injustice clearly, they want to do something about it. They just need someone brave enough to stand up first. Someone like me, Clara said. Someone like you, Jacob confirmed. Martha stood, moved around the counter to take Clara's hands. I'll help however I can. I'll talk to people, spread the word about what really happened. And I'll make sure everyone knows Thomas's reputation for honesty, that his records can be trusted. Thank you, Clara said, squeezing Martha's hands. The older woman had been kind to her since Thomas's death, but this was more than kindness. This was choosing a side, knowing it might cost her business or worse. The bell above the door suddenly jangled, making all three of them jump. The shade was still drawn, the closed sign still showing, but someone was trying the door handle insistently. Martha Hayes! A man's voice called from outside. I know you're in there, open up. Sheriff's business. Martha exchanged glances with Clara and Jacob, then moved to unlock the door. Sheriff Cartwright stepped inside, his face grave. Behind him stood two of Silas Trent's ranch hands, not the two from yesterday, but two others Clara recognized from seeing them in town. Both wore pistols on their hips and carried themselves with the swagger of men who knew they had power behind them. Ben, Martha said carefully, what's this about? I'm sorry, Martha, Ben said, and he did look genuinely apologetic. But I've got a warrant here. He pulled a paper from his jacket. Judge Morrison issued a search order for any and all financial records belonging to Thomas Dawson, to be held as evidence in the debt case between Silas Trent and Clara Dawson. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. You can't, I don't have a choice, Clara. Ben wouldn't meet her eyes. It's a legal warrant. I have to execute it. Where are Thomas's business records? Not here, Clara said truthfully. Thank God she'd taken them to Jacob's cabin. Thomas's journal is with his other personal effects. Then I need to search your house, Ben said. These men are here as witnesses to ensure everything's done proper and legal. One of Silas's men smiled, showing teeth. Mr. Trent wants to make sure there's no chance of those records being altered or destroyed. Can't have evidence disappearing now, can we? Jacob had gone very still, his body language subtly shifting into something coiled and dangerous. Clara put a hand on his arm, felt the tension thrumming through him. It's all right, she said quietly. Let them search. They won't find anything, because the journal was safe, hidden beneath Jacob's floorboards, where Silas Trent and his bought judge would never think to look. But as Sheriff Cartwright and Silas's men prepared to escort Clara to her house for the search, she realized something troubling. This warrant, issued so quickly, meant Silas had anticipated her next move. He'd known she would try to preserve evidence. He'd known she would seek help, which meant he was watching her more closely than she'd realized. And he was always one step ahead. The search of Clara's house was methodical and invasive. Silas's men went through every drawer, every cupboard, every trunk. They pulled up floorboards, checked behind pictures, emptied out Thomas's desk completely. Sheriff Cartwright supervised but didn't participate, standing near the door with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Clara watched them tear through her private things with a calm she didn't entirely feel. Let them search, she thought. Let them turn the house upside down. They wouldn't find what they were looking for. After an hour, the men admitted defeat. No journal, no ledgers, no financial records of any kind beyond a few recent receipts for household goods. Where is it? The taller of Silas's men demanded, getting in Clara's face. Thomas Dawson kept records. Everyone knows that. What did you do with them? My husband's personal effects are none of your concern, Clara said evenly. The warrant says you can search for them. It doesn't say I have to tell you where they are. The man looked like he wanted to argue, maybe even threaten, but Sheriff Cartwright stepped forward. That's enough, Hayes. The warrant's been executed. We didn't find anything. That's the end of it. Mr. Trent's not going to be happy, Hayes muttered. Then Mr. Trent can take it up with Judge Morrison, Ben said firmly. Now get out. Both of you. The two ranch hands left with obvious reluctance, shooting dark looks at Clara as they departed. Once they were gone, Ben turned to Clara with a heavy sigh. I'm sorry about this, he said. I know how it looks. It looks like Silas owns the law in this town, Clara said. Ben flinched but didn't argue. For what it's worth, I'm glad they didn't find what they were looking for. And Clara, be careful. Silas is going to escalate from here. He doesn't like being thwarted. After Ben left, Clara stood in her ransacked house and felt the full weight of what she was facing. Her home had been violated, her privacy shredded, all under the cover of law. And this was just the beginning. She began methodically putting things back in order, refolding clothes, returning books to shelves, gathering scattered papers. It was mindless work, but it gave her hands something to do while her mind raced. A knock at the door made her tense, but it was only Jacob, slipping in quietly through the growing dusk. Saw the sheriff leave, he said. They find anything? No, the journal's safe. Clara set down the stack of linens she'd been folding. But Jacob, Silas got a warrant within hours of our conversation with Martha. He's moving faster than we expected. He's scared, Jacob said. Scared people make mistakes. We just need to be patient, wait for him to overreach. Patient. Clara laughed without humor. I have less than a week before he tries to seize this house. How patient can I afford to be? Jacob moved to the window, checked the street outside in that careful way of his. Tomorrow we go see Samuel Porter. If we can convince him to talk about what happened to his daughter-in-law, if we can get him to go on record. Martha said he won't. Martha said he's afraid. Fear and won't aren't the same thing. Jacob turned back to her. Sometimes people just need to see someone else being brave first. You're being brave, Clara. Maybe that'll be enough to help Samuel find his own courage. Clara wanted to believe that. She wanted to think that her stand would inspire others, that Cold Creek would rally against Silas Trent's corruption. But she'd lived here all her life, and she knew how easily fear could silence good intentions. Still, what choice did she have? She could run, leave Cold Creek entirely, start over somewhere else. But that would mean abandoning Thomas's memory, surrendering to Silas's lies, admitting that power mattered more than truth. No, she would stay, and she would fight, and if she lost, well, at least she would lose knowing she'd tried. All right, she said. Tomorrow we visit Samuel Porter, and we keep building our case, keep telling the truth, keep pushing back however we can. Jacob nodded approval. That's the spirit. Now, you eaten anything today? Clara realized she hadn't, not since the early morning coffee at his cabin. No. Then let me make you something. You need to keep your strength up. He moved toward her small kitchen, began pulling out bread and cheese, the practical movements of a man accustomed to taking care of himself. Clara watched him work, and felt a sudden surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. This man, this quiet recluse who owed her nothing, was standing beside her against forces that could destroy them both. Not for money, not for obligation, but simply because it was right. Jacob, she said softly. He paused, looked at her questioningly. Thank you. For everything. She gestured vaguely, encompassing the past days, his protection, his partnership in this fight, for not letting me face this alone. Jacob's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained watchful. You remind me that there are still things worth protecting in this world, he said simply. Now eat. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. After Jacob left for his cabin, Clara locked her doors and tried to sleep. But rest came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of Thomas's face and the sound of papers rustling as strangers rifled through her life. Morning arrived grey and cold, threatening rain. Clara dressed in her warmest clothes, knowing the ride to Samuel Porter's ranch would take most of the day. She was just braiding her hair when she heard horses outside. Heart pounding, she went to the window and felt relief wash over her. Jacob sat astride a sturdy grey mare, leading a second horse, a gentle bay gelding that Clara recognized from the livery stable. She grabbed her shawl and went outside. "You rented horses?" "Borrowed," Jacob corrected. "Pete at the livery owed me a favor from last winter. These two will get us to Porter's place and back before dark." He dismounted, helped Clara up onto the bay with surprising gentleness. "You ride much?" "Not since I was a girl, but it comes back to you, doesn't it?" Clara settled into the saddle, found her balance. The bay stood patient beneath her, ears flicking back as if listening for her signals. They rode out of town, just as the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time they reached the mountain trail that led to Samuel Porter's ranch, the drizzle had become a steady rainfall that soaked through their clothes and turned the path to mud. But neither suggested turning back. Samuel Porter's place sat in a high valley, good grazing land sheltered by ridges on three sides. The ranch house was small but well maintained, smoke rising from the chimney promising warmth inside. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and Clara could see that despite his age and losses, Samuel still ran a working operation. They tied their horses under the shelter of the barn's overhang and approached the house. Jacob knocked firmly, and after a moment the door opened to reveal an old man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. "Jacob Holt," Samuel said, surprise evident in his voice. "Don't often see you this far from your mountain. And Mrs. Dawson, what brings you two out in weather like this?" "Need to talk to you, Samuel," Jacob said. "About Silas Trent." Something shuddered in the old man's expression. "Got nothing to say about Silas Trent." "Please," Clara said before he could close the door. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for. I just need to understand what happened to your daughter-in-law." "Because he's doing the same thing to me." Samuel stood frozen for a long moment, then sighed and stepped back. "Come in then. No sense letting you catch your death out there." The interior of the house was warm and neat, with the sparse cleanliness of a man living alone. Samuel gestured to chairs near the fire, poured them coffee from a pot on the stove, and settled into his own chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones ached. "Elizabeth," he said finally, "my son David's wife. Prettiest thing you ever saw, with a spirit to match." David was so proud when she agreed to marry him. The old man's hands trembled slightly around his cup. They had one good year together, just one. Then David went down into the Silver Creek mine and didn't come back up. Gavin took 3 men that day. Clara listened, her heart aching for the losses this family had endured. "Elizabeth was destroyed," Samuel continued, "but she tried to be strong for the baby's sake. Little Matthew was only 6 months old when his daddy died. Elizabeth wanted to stay here, raise the boy on the ranch. But," his voice went hard, "2 months after we buried David, Silas Trent came calling with a piece of paper saying David owed him $500. Said it was a loan for improvements to our water system, all proper and legal. But there was no loan," Clara said quietly. "There wasn't. David and I had done all that work ourselves, with materials we bought from Thomas Dawson's store. I had the receipts to prove it. But Silas had a promissory note with David's signature, and Judge Morrison ruled in his favor." Samuel's eyes grew distant. "Elizabeth lost everything. The house we'd built for her and David, the small savings they'd put aside, all of it seized to pay a debt that never existed. Her family back east sent money for train tickets, and she left Montana with Matthew in her arms and her life in ruins." "Have you heard from her?" Clara asked. "Christmas cards every year. She remarried eventually, a decent man who treats her well from what she says. But she won't speak of Montana, won't let Matthew know anything about his father or his heritage here. It's like she erased that part of her life entirely." Samuel looked at Clara with eyes full of old rage and older pain. And I let it happen. I had the receipts, I knew the truth, but I was afraid. Afraid Silas would destroy what little I had left. Afraid to stand up to a man with money and power and the law on his side. You're not the only one who's been afraid, Jacob said gently. That's how men like Silas operate. They count on fear keeping people silent. So why are you here? Samuel asked. What do you want from an old man who failed his family? Clara leaned forward, made sure Samuel was looking at her. I want you to know you're not alone in what happened. That Silas has done this to others, that it's a pattern. And I want you to know that I'm going to fight him, and I could use your help. Help how? Testifying. Samuel shook his head. I can't. I'm too old, too tired, and I have nothing left for Silas to take except this land, and he'd find a way to take it if I crossed him. What if there was a way to stop him? Clara pulled out Thomas's pocket watch, the one she'd been carrying for comfort. This was my husband's. He died 6 months ago, and now Silas is trying to steal my home with the same kind of forged debt he used against Elizabeth. But I have proof the debt doesn't exist. I have Thomas's journal, every transaction documented for 20 years. And I have people in town who are starting to realize what Silas has been doing. She set the watch on the table between them, its silver surface catching the firelight. This watch has been passed down through Thomas's family for 3 generations. It survived a war, a fire, years of hard frontier living. Thomas gave it to me the night before he died. Told me to keep it safe because it represented time. Time we'd had together, time he wished we'd have in the future, and time that's precious and can't be bought or sold. Samuel looked at the watch, then at Clara's face. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm asking you to give me time, Clara said. I'm not asking you to testify tomorrow or even next week. I'm just asking you to hold on to your courage a little longer. Let me build my case against Silas. Let me show the town what he really is. And when the moment comes, if it comes, I need to know if I can count on you to stand with me and tell the truth about what happened to Elizabeth. The old man was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Outside, rain drummed against the roof with steady insistence. Finally, Samuel reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather-bound book, no bigger than his palm. This was David's Bible, he said. He carried it every day, even down into the mines. It was in his pocket when he died. See this? He pointed to a puckered scar in the leather, a groove that went nearly through the book. It took a bullet that was meant for him during the war. Saved his life then, couldn't save him from falling rock later. He held the Bible out to Clara. You keep this, not as a loan, but as a promise. When the time comes, if you can really build a case against Silas, I'll stand up. I'll tell Elizabeth's story. I'll show those receipts I've kept all these years. I may be old and afraid, but maybe it's time to remember that my son was brave, and his widow was brave, and the least I can do is honor that. Clara took the Bible carefully, feeling the weight of it, the significance. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Samuel. Don't thank me yet, the old man said. Just make sure you know what you're getting into. Silas Trent doesn't fight fair, and he doesn't forgive. You come at him, you better not miss. We won't miss, Jacob said with quiet certainty. They left Samuel's ranch as the rain was tapering off, the Bible safely wrapped in Clara's shawl. The ride back to Cold Creek was slower, both of them tired from the emotional weight of the conversation. But Clara felt something she hadn't felt in days, hope. Small and fragile but real. That was well done, Jacob said as they descended the mountain trail. What you said about the watch, about time, that reached him. It was true, Clara replied. Time is the one thing Silas can't buy or forge or steal. And the more time we have, the more chance we have to expose him. They reached town as dusk was falling. Jacob walked Clara to her door, checked inside to make sure nothing had been disturbed in her absence, then prepared to return the horses to the livery. Jacob, Clara said before he could leave.
Come back after?
I want to show you Thomas's journal properly. Let you see the kind of man he was through his own words. Something flickered in Jacob's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude at being invited into that private space. All right, he said. Give me an hour. Clara used that hour to dry off, change into warm clothes, and make a simple supper. When Jacob returned, she pulled Thomas's journal from its hiding place under her own floorboards. A second copy she'd kept, containing the most recent year's entries. The older volumes were still safe at Jacob's cabin, but this would be enough to show him what she meant. They sat at the small kitchen table, and Clara opened the journal to a random page. Thomas's neat handwriting filled the lines, recording the day's transactions with meticulous care. "See here," Clara said, pointing. "Every entry dated and initialed. Every credit clearly noted, every debt recorded when it was incurred and when it was paid. He treated his ledger like a sacred text, said a man's word should be as solid as his written accounts." Jacob studied the pages, his weathered fingers tracing the columns. "You can see his character in this. No shortcuts, no convenient omissions. Just the truth day after day. That's why Silas's forgery is so offensive," Clara said. "It's not just stealing my property. It's defaming Thomas's memory, claiming he was dishonest or careless when he was neither." She closed the journal, held it against her chest. "I need to protect this. Not just the physical book, but what it represents." "Then that's what we'll do," Jacob said. He reached across the table, covered her hand with his. His palm was rough and warm, calloused from years of outdoor work. "Clara, I want you to understand something. When I came to these mountains 15 years ago, I was running from everything, from duty, from connection, from caring about anything beyond my own survival. I told myself I was better off alone, that caring just meant more ways to get hurt." He paused, seemed to gather himself. "You've reminded me that's a coward's answer, that some things are worth the risk of caring. Your friendship, this fight for justice, it matters. And I'm seeing it through with you, whatever comes." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing to care again." They sat in comfortable silence after that, drinking coffee and watching the fire burn low. It was late when Jacob finally stood to leave, and Clara walked him to the door. "Lock this behind me," he instructed. "And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you fire 3 shots from that rifle I know Thomas kept in the bedroom. I'll hear it and come running." "I will," Clara promised. After he left, she did lock the door, checked all the windows, and prepared for bed. But before she lay down, she took Thomas's pocket watch, the one she'd promised to Jacob for safekeeping, and set it on her bedside table. Beside it, she placed Samuel Porter's bullet-scarred Bible, 2 artifacts, 2 promises. Time and faith intertwined. Tomorrow she would take the watch to Jacob as planned, let him hide it with the other documents. But tonight, she wanted it close, wanted to feel the connection to Thomas and to the fight she'd committed herself to. Outside, Cold Creek settled into nighttime quiet. In the valley below, lights burned in Silas Trent's ranch house, and Clara wondered what plans he was making, what strategies he was devising to crush her resistance. Let him plan, she thought. She had her own plans now, her own allies, her own determination. Silas Trent had built his empire on fear and fraud, but empires had fallen before. And sometimes it only took one person saying no to start the collapse. Clara closed her eyes, Thomas's watch ticking softly beside her, and slept more peacefully than she had in days. The peace didn't last. Clara woke to pounding on her door 3 hours before dawn, the kind of urgent hammering that meant trouble. She grabbed her robe and the rifle Jacob had mentioned, her heart racing as she approached the door. "Who's there?" "It's Martha, Clara. Let me in quickly." Clara opened the door to find Martha Hayes standing in the darkness, her face pale and frightened. "What's wrong?" "Judge Morrison filed papers late yesterday evening. The hearing on Silas's debt claim has been moved up. It's scheduled for tomorrow morning, this morning now, I suppose. 10 o'clock. Martha stepped inside, wringing her hands. "Clara, that gives you less than 7 hours to prepare a defense." The rifle nearly slipped from Clara's hands. "That's impossible. Silas said I had a week. Even his forged note gave me time to—" "He lied, or changed his mind, or Judge Morrison decided to rush it through." Martha's voice was sharp with anger. "My nephew who works at the courthouse came to tell me as soon as he saw the notice. He knows it's wrong, knows the whole thing stinks, but what can he do? He's just a clerk." Clara set the rifle down carefully, trying to think through the panic clouding her mind. I need to get word to Jacob, and I need to get Thomas's journal from his cabin. Without it, I have no proof. I'll ride up to Jacob's place, Martha said. You gather whatever else you need. Papers, witnesses if you have them, anything that might help. Meet us at the courthouse by 9:30, so we have time before the hearing starts. After Martha left, Clara moved through her house in a kind of controlled frenzy, pulling together every document she had, the deed to her house, her marriage certificate, receipts from Thomas's transactions with various merchants, letters from business associates praising his honesty. It wasn't enough, not without the journal, but it was something. She was just finishing when someone knocked again. This time it was Sheriff Cartwright, looking grim and exhausted. "Don't suppose you've heard," he said without preamble. "About the hearing?" "Yes, Martha told me." Ben nodded. "Clara, I want you to know, I think this is wrong. The whole thing. But Judge Morrison made it clear that if I don't ensure you appear in court, he'll hold me in contempt. So I'm here officially to notify you that your presence is required at 10 o'clock this morning to answer Silas Trent's debt claim." "I'll be there," Clara said. "And unofficially," Ben lowered his voice, "I'd suggest you have good representation. A lawyer. If you can find one willing to go against Silas, there isn't a lawyer within 50 miles who'd take my case against Silas Trent, and you know it. Then you'll have to defend yourself, which means you need evidence, witnesses, and a good argument." Ben glanced around at the papers Clara had assembled. "Is that all you have?" "I have Thomas's journal. It proves there was no debt. Where is it?" Clara hesitated, but Ben held up a hand. "Don't tell me." "I don't want to know. Just make sure you have it at that courthouse, because without it, Morrison will rule against you before noon, and Silas will have your property by supper time." After Ben left, Clara sat in her darkened house and tried to steady herself. The hearing was happening in hours, not days. She'd thought she had time to build a case, to gather support, to expose Silas's pattern of fraud. Instead, she was being rushed into a courtroom controlled by a corrupt judge with barely any preparation. "Think," she told herself. "You have the journal. You have your testimony. You have Jacob as a witness to yesterday's assault. What else? The compass. Thomas's silver compass, the one that always pointed true north. He'd given it to her on their first anniversary. Told her it represented their marriage. No matter which way life pulled them, they'd always find their way back to each other. She found it in her jewelry box, held it in her palm. The needle swung, settled, pointed steadily north. True north. The right path, even when everything else was confusion and fear. She would take the compass to court with her, not as evidence exactly, but as a reminder of what she was fighting for. Truth, integrity, the right path, even when it was the hard path. Dawn was breaking when Jacob and Martha arrived together, both looking worried but determined. Jacob had Thomas's journal wrapped in oilcloth, protected from any weather. They sat at Clara's kitchen table and went through their strategy. "The journal is our strongest evidence," Jacob said, laying out the leather-bound book. "It clearly shows no loan from Silas, no debt of any kind. Morrison will try to discredit it, but the entries are dated, detailed, and consistent over years. That kind of record is hard to forge or dismiss. I can testify to Thomas's character," Martha offered. "I bought the store from Clara, saw his bookkeeping myself. Everyone in town knew Thomas Dawson was honest to a fault. And I'll testify about what happened at my cabin," Jacob said. How Silas threatened Clara, grabbed her, behaved in a way that shows this isn't about legitimate debt collection. It's about intimidation and theft. Clara nodded, grateful for their support but still afraid. "What if Morrison won't let you testify? What if he rules the journal inadmissible?" "Then we make sure everyone in that courtroom sees it anyway," Jacob said grimly. "Morrison may be corrupt, but he still needs to maintain some appearance of fairness. There'll be people watching, people who'll talk afterward. We use that." They arrived at the courthouse at 9:30 to find it already filling with townspeople. Word had spread fast about the hearing, and it seemed like half of Cold Creek had turned out to watch. Clara saw faces she recognized, shopkeepers, farmers, miners, families who'd known Thomas and her for years. Some looked sympathetic, others merely curious, but they were all there. Silas Trent stood near the front with two well-dressed men Clara didn't recognize, lawyers from the territorial capital, no doubt brought in to ensure his victory. He saw Clara enter and smiled, the expression cold and confident. Judge Morrison's courtroom was a simple space, more suited to minor disputes and land claims than serious legal proceedings. But Morrison himself, when he emerged from his chambers, looked every inch the authority figure. Black robes, severe expression, grey hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome in youth, but had hardened into something autocratic with age. "Court is in session," Morrison announced, rapping his gavel. "Case of Trent versus Dawson regarding collection of debt. Mr. Trent, present your case." One of Silas's lawyers stood, a slick man named Harrington with a voice like oil and water mixed. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of debt collection. My client, Mr. Silas Trent, loaned the late Thomas Dawson $500 for business purposes 3 years ago. Said loan was documented in a promissory note duly signed by Mr. Dawson." He produced the forged note with a flourish. "Despite repeated attempts to collect, the debt remains unpaid. We ask the court to rule in Mr. Trent's favor and authorize seizure of property to satisfy the debt, plus interest and court costs." "Mrs. Dawson," Morrison said, turning his attention to Clara with barely concealed impatience, "do you have representation?" "I'm representing myself, Your Honor," Clara said, standing. Her voice shook slightly, but she forced herself to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Very well, present your defense." Clara stepped forward, carrying Thomas's journal. "Your Honor, my husband Thomas Dawson kept meticulous financial records for over 20 years. This journal documents every business transaction, every loan, every debt incurred or paid. There is no entry for any loan from Mr. Trent. No such debt ever existed." She opened the journal, showed the pages to Morrison. The judge glanced at them briefly, his expression dismissive. "Mrs. Dawson, anyone can create a ledger after the fact. This proves nothing except that you have access to paper and ink. This isn't created after the fact," Clara protested. "You can see the progression of dates, the consistency of the handwriting over years. My husband updated this journal daily. It's a complete record. It's a record you control," Harrington interrupted smoothly. "A record that could easily have been altered or falsified to support your claim. Your Honor, the promissory note is a legal document, properly signed and witnessed. It should take precedence over an informal journal that Mrs. Dawson herself admits to having exclusive access to." Morrison nodded. "The lawyer makes a valid point. Mrs. Dawson, unless you have independent verification of these records, I'm inclined to give more weight to the promissory note." "I can provide verification," Martha Hayes said, standing from the gallery. "Your Honor, I purchased Mr. Dawson's general store from Mrs. Dawson 6 months ago. Before the sale, I reviewed his business records extensively. They were immaculate, complete, and entirely consistent with this journal. Thomas Dawson was known throughout Cold Creek for his honesty and careful bookkeeping." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Hayes, you're not a financial expert. Your opinion on Mr. Dawson's bookkeeping practices is noted, but not particularly relevant to the legal question at hand." "Then I'd like to testify, Your Honor," Jacob said, standing. His voice carried through the courtroom with quiet authority. "I witnessed Mr. Trent's behavior toward Mrs. Dawson 2 days ago. His conduct suggested this debt claim is not legitimate business, but rather harassment and intimidation." "And you are?" Morrison asked coldly. "Jacob Holt. I own property adjacent to where the incident occurred." "The Mountain Hermit," Harrington said with open contempt. "Your Honor, Mr. Holt has no relevant testimony regarding the validity of the promissory note. What he claims to have witnessed is immaterial to the debt question." "I'm inclined to agree," Morrison said. "Mr. Holt, unless you have direct knowledge of financial transactions between Mr. Trent and Mr. Dawson, your testimony is not relevant." Clara felt the case slipping away from her. Morrison was systematically excluding every piece of evidence and testimony she had. The courtroom had gone quiet, people sensing the rigged nature of the proceedings. "Your Honor," Clara said, her voice rising, "this is not a legitimate debt. Mr. Trent has used similar false claims against other residents of Cold Creek. There's a pattern of fraud." Morrison's gavel came down hard. "Mrs. Dawson, you will not make unfounded accusations in my court. Do you have any actual evidence beyond this journal that the debt doesn't exist?" Clara's mind raced. She thought of Samuel Porter, of the receipts he'd mentioned, of Elizabeth's story. But Samuel wasn't here, and those receipts referred to a different case, a different victim. She had no way to prove the pattern, no way to show that this was Silas's standard method of stealing property. "Unless, Your Honor," she said, an idea forming, "I request that you examine the promissory note more carefully. If it's authentic, it should show signs of age appropriate to a document 3 years old. The paper, the ink, the wear patterns, these things can be verified." Morrison's expression flickered, annoyance perhaps, or concern that she'd found an angle he hadn't anticipated. "That's an unusual request, but a reasonable one," Clara pressed. "If Mr. Trent claims this document is 3 years old, surely it should look 3 years old. I'd like an independent expert to examine it." Harrington was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. Mrs. Dawson is grasping at straws to avoid paying a legitimate debt. The note's authenticity is not in question. It bears Mr. Dawson's signature. A signature that could have been traced or forged." Clara shot back. "Thomas signed hundreds of documents. Getting a sample of his signature would be simple enough for someone determined to create a false note." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. People were leaning forward, engaged now, seeing Clara fight back against the forces stacked against her. Morrison banged his gavel for silence. "Enough. Mrs. Dawson, do you have an expert witness who can examine the document?" "No, Your Honor, but surely in the interest of justice—" "Justice has been served," Morrison interrupted. "I've reviewed the evidence. The promissory note appears authentic and properly executed. Mrs. Dawson's journal, while interesting, does not constitute proof that the debt doesn't exist. It merely shows that her late husband either failed to record it or chose not to record it for reasons of his own." "That's absurd," Clara said, her voice shaking with anger now. "My husband recorded every penny spent and earned. He would never—" "Your opinion of your husband's habits is noted," Morrison said coldly. "However, this court deals in legal facts, not spousal loyalty. Mr. Harrington, I'm prepared to rule." This was it, Clara realized. Morrison was about to rule in Silas's favor, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She looked at Jacob, saw the frustration and anger in his eyes. Looked at Martha, who was pale with shock. Looked at the assembled townspeople, many of whom were shaking their heads or whispering furiously. They all knew it was wrong. They all saw the corruption playing out in front of them. But seeing it and stopping it were two different things. "However," Morrison continued, and something in his tone made Clara's attention snap back to him, "in the interest of appearing thorough, I will allow one final piece of testimony. Mrs. Dawson, you claim your husband would never have failed to record a debt. Is there anyone who can testify to his character and business practices beyond yourself and Mrs. Hayes?" It was a trap, Clara realized. Morrison was giving her hope just so he could crush it more thoroughly when no one came forward. But then, from the back of the courtroom, a voice spoke up. "I can testify, Your Honor." Every head turned. Samuel Porter stood there, his old frame straight, his weathered face set with determination. He wore his Sunday clothes and carried a leather satchel that Clara recognized, the one containing the receipts he'd mentioned, the proof of his own family's victimization. "Samuel," Clara whispered, hope flaring in her chest. The old rancher walked slowly down the aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He stopped before the judge's bench and met Morrison's eyes without flinching. "Samuel Porter, Your Honor. I knew Thomas Dawson for near about 30 years. And I have something this court needs to see." He opened the satchel, pulled out a sheaf of papers. "These are receipts from Thomas Dawson's store, documenting materials my son David purchased for ranch improvements 8 years ago. Materials that Silas Trent claimed David borrowed money to buy, money that my daughter-in-law supposedly owed after David died." The courtroom went dead silent. Silas Trent's face had gone white, then red. Your Honor, Harrington said quickly, this is completely irrelevant to the case at hand. It's entirely relevant, Samuel said, his voice gaining strength, because it shows a pattern. Thomas Dawson's records prove my son paid cash for those materials. No loan, no debt. But Silas Trent produced a promissory note, just like the one he's using against Mrs. Dawson, claiming money was owed. Judge Morrison, you ruled in Trent's favor then, just like you're about to rule in his favor now. But the truth is, both notes are forgeries. Both debts are lies. And it's time someone in this town said so out loud. Morrison's gavel came down like a gunshot. Mr. Porter, you are out of order. This court's previous ruling is not under review. Maybe it should be, someone called from the gallery. Clara turned to see Pete, the ranch hand who'd been with Silas at Jacob's cabin, standing with his hat in his hands. Maybe a lot of things should be reviewed, Your Honor, because I've seen Mr. Trent with blank promissory notes, and I've heard him talking about finding signatures to trace. I worked for him for 5 years, and I'm done pretending I don't know what he's been doing. The courtroom erupted. People were on their feet shouting, some in support of Clara and Samuel, others defending Silas. Morrison pounded his gavel until Clara thought it might break, but the chaos continued. And through it all, Clara stood holding Thomas's compass, feeling its weight in her hand, watching as the careful facade of Silas Trent's empire began to crack. Judge Morrison finally restored order by threatening to clear the courtroom entirely. The spectators settled into tense silence, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had been a routine proceeding, a powerful man crushing a widow through legal manipulation, had transformed into something else. The truth was out now, messy and undeniable, and there was no putting it back in the box. Mr. Porter, Morrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, your allegations are serious and, I must say, highly inappropriate. You're making claims about this court's past rulings without any— I have proof, Your Honor, Samuel interrupted, his fear seemingly burned away by righteous anger. These receipts, signed by Thomas Dawson, dated and documented. They show my son paid cash for materials that Silas claimed were purchased with borrowed money. Thomas's journal would have the same transactions recorded on his end. Cross-reference them. The truth is right there for anyone honest enough to look. Silas was on his feet now, his face a mask of controlled fury. Your Honor, this is a circus. Samuel Porter is a bitter old man nursing a decade-old grudge. His so-called evidence is meaningless. Then you won't mind if it's examined, Jacob said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He'd moved to stand beside Samuel, and together the two men presented a united front. If the receipts and Thomas's journal contradict your promissory note, that proves fraud. If they support it, then Mrs. Dawson loses and you win. Simple enough? Morrison looked trapped, his eyes darting between Silas and the crowd of townspeople watching with intense attention. Clara could see the calculation in his face. He wanted to rule for Silas. Had probably already been paid to do so, but the situation had escalated beyond a simple corrupt judgment. Too many people were watching now. Too many questions were being raised. This hearing is getting out of hand, Morrison said finally. I'm calling a recess until this afternoon, 2 o'clock. At that time, I will review all evidence presented, including Mr. Porter's receipts, and make my ruling. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. People began filing out of the courtroom, their voices rising in animated discussion. Clara felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Martha, her eyes bright with cautious hope. You did it, Martha whispered. You got Samuel to come forward. I didn't know he would, Clara admitted. And Pete, where did that come from? Conscience, maybe, Jacob said, joining them. He nodded toward the ranch hand, who was being ushered out quickly by Silas's other men. Interesting that he spoke up. Might be willing to testify further if we can get to him before Silas silences him. Samuel Porter approached, looking older and more tired than he had during his testimony, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Clara, I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner. Spent too many years being afraid. You came forward when it mattered most, Clara said, taking his weathered hand. Thank you, Samuel. Thank you for being brave. David would have wanted me to. the old man said simply. And Elizabeth, she deserves to know her husband's name is being cleared, even if it's 8 years too late. They moved out into the crisp morning air. The courthouse steps were crowded with people debating what they'd witnessed. Clara heard her name repeated, Thomas's name, Silas's name. The whisper network of a small town was spinning into overdrive. Silas Trent emerged from the courthouse with his lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. He spotted Clara and crossed the distance between them with quick, angry strides. "Clever," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Very clever, getting that old fool to dredge up ancient history. But it won't matter. Morrison will rule in my favor this afternoon, and you'll lose everything. I'll make sure of it." "You're scared," Clara said, surprised by her own calm. "All these years, you've counted on fear, keeping your victims silent. But we're not silent anymore, and you can't control what happens when people start telling the truth." Silas's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. "You think you've won something here? You think—" He didn't finish. Jacob's hand clamped on Silas's wrist, breaking his grip with surgical precision, the same move he'd used at the cabin. But this time, there were dozens of witnesses, and several of them gasped audibly. "Second time you've laid hands on her," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying none the less. "Won't be a third." Silas jerked his hand back as if burned. His face was crimson with rage and humiliation. "I'll have you arrested for assault." "Go ahead," Jacob said. "We're standing on courthouse steps with half the town watching. Everyone here saw you grab her first. Make your complaint. I'll make mine. We'll see how it plays out." For a long moment, Silas stood there, breathing hard, his carefully constructed image of civilized businessmen crumbling before everyone's eyes. Then he spun on his heel and stalked toward his waiting carriage, his lawyers hurrying after him. Sheriff Cartwright, who'd been watching from the courthouse doors, approached with a heavy sigh. "Clara, Jacob, you're playing a dangerous game. Silas isn't going to take this lying down." "We know," Clara said. "But Ben, you saw what happened in there. You saw Samuel's receipts, heard Pete's testimony. Doesn't that matter to you?" "Of course it matters," Ben said, his voice rough with frustration. "But what am I supposed to do? I'm the sheriff of a town where the judge is corrupt and the wealthiest man is a criminal. I enforce the law as it's given to me. When the law itself is crooked," he shook his head. "Just be careful. Watch your backs. And Clara, that recess Morrison called, use that time well. If you can find more evidence, more witnesses, anything to make his ruling in Silas's favor look even worse than it already does." They retreated to Martha's store to regroup. She closed the shop, hung a sign saying she'd reopen at 1 o'clock, and ushered Clara, Jacob, and Samuel into the back room where they could talk privately. "We have 4 hours," Martha said, putting coffee on to boil. "What do we need to do?" "Find Pete," Jacob said immediately. "If he's willing to testify about Silas forging notes, about seeing blank promissory notes in Silas's possession, that's direct evidence of fraud." "He'll be at Silas's ranch," Samuel pointed out. "Silas will have him under guard. Make sure he can't talk to anyone." "Then we need to get him away from the ranch," Clara said. She was thinking rapidly, pieces falling into place. "Martha, didn't you say Pete has family in town?" "A sister, I think." "Helen," Martha confirmed. "Helen Garrett. Lives on the east side with her husband and 3 children. Pete helps support them, sends money every month. So if Helen sent word that there was an emergency with one of the children, Pete would come," Clara said. "And if he happened to encounter us on his way to town—" "That's risky," Jacob warned. "If Silas finds out we engineered it, he could claim witness tampering." "It's not tampering if we just happen to be in the right place at the right time," Martha said with a small smile. "I'll go talk to Helen. She's a good woman, and she's never liked Silas much. If I explain what's at stake, be careful," Clara said. "If Silas suspects, let me worry about that," Martha said, already putting on her shawl. "You 3 figure out what else we need. I'll be back within the hour." After Martha left, Clara, Jacob, and Samuel spread out the evidence they had. Thomas's journal, Samuel's receipts, the forged promissory note. It painted a clear picture of fraud, but would it be enough to overcome Morrison's corruption? "What we're missing," Samuel said slowly, "is motive. Why Clara's property specifically? I understand why Silas wanted Elizabeth's house, good location for his warehouse. But what makes Clara's place so valuable? The railroad, Clara said. Martha and I discussed this. There's been talk of bringing a spur line to Cold Creek, and Clara's property sits right on one of the proposed routes. Jacob pulled out a folded map he'd been carrying. I borrowed this from the land office this morning. Look, he spread it out on the table. If the railroad comes through here, connecting Cold Creek to the main line, it transforms the whole valley. Suddenly, freight can move in and out efficiently. Cattle can be shipped to market without a 2-week drive. Timber from the mountains becomes profitable. Everything changes, and whoever controls the land along the route controls access, Samuel said, understanding dawning. Silas could charge whatever he wants for right-of-way, could build his own depot, could monopolize all the commerce that comes through. Clara studied the map, seeing Cold Creek marked in the center of the narrow valley, the proposed rail line marked in faint pencil running from the south up through the town and continuing north into the timber country. Her property sat right in the path, along with several other parcels Silas had acquired over the past years through his fraudulent debt schemes. He's been planning this for years, she said softly. Every property he's stolen, every family he's destroyed, it's all been building toward this. He's not just a cruel man taking advantage of vulnerable people. He's been executing a long-term strategy to control the entire valley's economic future, which means he'll fight even harder to win this case, Jacob said. Because if he loses, if his fraud becomes public knowledge, the railroad company might refuse to deal with him. They won't want to be associated with someone facing criminal charges. Then we make sure his fraud does become public knowledge, Clara said with sudden determination. We don't just fight this case. We make sure everyone knows. The railroad company, the territorial government, every newspaper and business interest that might care. We expose him so completely that even if Morrison rules in his favor, Silas is finished anyway. Samuel was nodding slowly. The territorial marshal's office would care about this. Federal fraud, pattern of corruption, a judge taking bribes. That's their jurisdiction. How long would it take to get federal marshals here? Clara asked. Week, maybe 2 if we sent a telegram, and they took it seriously, Jacob said. He was looking at the map still, his expression thoughtful. But Clara, we don't have a week. We have 4 hours before Morrison rules, and once he does, once the property is legally transferred to Silas, it becomes much harder to reverse. Even if federal marshals eventually arrest Silas, you might never get your home back. The clock on Martha's wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of their limited time. Clara felt the pressure of it, the weight of knowing that everything might be decided this afternoon, that all their efforts might still result in loss. Then we use what we have, she said. We present everything to Morrison. The journal, Samuel's receipts, Pete's testimony, if Martha can get him here. We make the case so clear, so documented, that Morrison can't rule for Silas without looking completely corrupt. And we make sure enough people are watching that the ruling becomes news, becomes something the territorial government can't ignore. And if Morrison rules for Silas anyway? Jacob asked quietly. Clara met his eyes, saw the concern there, the protectiveness. Then I lose my home but keep my integrity. And we take the fight to the next level. Federal courts, territorial government, whatever it takes. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about stopping Silas from doing this to anyone else. Martha returned sooner than expected, slightly out of breath but smiling. It's done. Helen sent word to Pete that her youngest has a fever and she needs him. Pete's already left the ranch. I saw him riding toward town on my way back. He should be here in 20 minutes or so. Will Helen be all right? Clara asked. If Silas finds out she helped us, she knows the risks and she's willing to take them. Says she's tired of being afraid of Silas Trent, tired of watching him hurt people. Her words, not mine. Martha poured coffee for everyone. Now what happens when Pete gets here? They discussed strategy while they waited. How to approach Pete, what questions to ask, how to ensure his testimony would be admissible and credible. Jacob suggested they meet Pete outside, where they wouldn't seem to be coercing or coaching him. Just concerned citizens having a conversation on a public street. When Pete finally appeared, riding slowly down Main Street toward his sister's house, they were waiting on the boardwalk outside Martha's store. He saw them and pulled up his horse, his expression wary. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, touching his hat brim. "Halt. Heard my nephew's sick." "Is it serious?" "False alarm," Martha said gently. Helen was worried, but the boy's feeling better already. "Just a touch of fever, nothing serious." Pete's eyes narrowed slightly. He was no fool. He could see he'd been lured here. "So why are you all standing here looking at me like I'm about to testify at a trial?" "Because you are," Clara said simply. "Pete, you spoke up in court this morning. You said you'd seen Silas with blank promissory notes, heard him talk about forging signatures. Was that true?" Pete was silent for a long moment, his hands tight on his reins. "Might have been. Might have been isn't enough," Jacob said. "We need to know if you're willing to tell the truth, under oath, this afternoon when court reconvenes. Tell what you've seen, what you know about Silas's operations." "You're asking me to end my career," Pete said flatly. "I work for Silas, have for years. I testify against him. I'm done in this valley. No one will hire me, no one will trust me. And what happens to my sister's family when I can't send them money anymore?" Clara stepped forward, looked up at Pete with complete honesty. "You're right. It will cost you. But Pete, how many more families have to be destroyed before someone with direct knowledge stands up? How many more widows? How many more children losing their homes? You have a chance to stop it. That's worth something." Pete looked at her, then at Samuel Porter standing there with his old shoulders straight, despite everything he'd lost. "Mr. Porter, your daughter-in-law, Elizabeth. She was kind to me once, when I was new to the valley and didn't know anybody. Brought me food when I was sick, didn't have to. I've thought about her sometimes, wondered where she ended up. She's in Ohio," Samuel said quietly. "Remarried. Has a good life now, or so she says in her letters. But she lost years to grief and poverty because of what Silas did. Your testimony might not change that, but it could prevent him from doing it to anyone else." The cowboy sat on his horse, the internal struggle visible on his weathered face. Finally he dismounted, tied his horse to the hitching post. "All right, I'll testify, but I want it known. I'm doing this because it's right, not because anyone forced me or paid me. And after I'm leaving this valley. Going somewhere Silas Trent's name doesn't mean anything." "Fair enough," Jacob said, offering his hand. Pete shook it, and in that gesture Clara saw another small victory. Another person choosing truth over fear. They spent the remaining time preparing Pete for what he'd face in court, making sure his testimony would be clear and credible. Samuel shared his own experience from the morning, warning Pete that Morrison would try to discredit him, that Silas's lawyers would attack his character and motives. "Let them," Pete said with growing confidence. "I've got nothing to hide. I've seen what I've seen, and the truth is the truth." When the clock struck 1:30, they began the walk back to the courthouse. Word had spread about the afternoon session, and even more people had gathered than in the morning. The steps and surrounding street were crowded with townspeople, all waiting to see how this drama would resolve. Clara walked through them with her head high, Thomas's compass in her pocket and his journal tucked under her arm. Jacob walked on one side, Samuel on the other, and Martha and Pete followed behind. It felt like more than just going to a hearing. It felt like leading a small army into battle, an army of truth against the forces of corruption and power. Inside the courtroom, Silas sat with his lawyers, his expression a carefully controlled mask of confidence. But Clara saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked Pete as they entered, the flash of what might have been fear before he suppressed it. Judge Morrison entered, his black robe seeming heavier somehow, his face set in hard lines. "Court is reconvened," he announced. "We will now hear any additional testimony or evidence before I make my ruling. Mrs. Dawson, do you have anything further to present?" Clara stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I have a witness who can testify to Mr. Trent's fraudulent practices. Mr. Pete Garrett has direct knowledge of—" "Objection." Harrington was on his feet instantly. "Your Honor, Mr. Garrett is a disgruntled employee, making allegations to deflect from his own termination." "I haven't been terminated," Pete said loudly, standing. Yet, but I will be after this, and I don't care. Your Honor, I've worked for Silas Trent for 5 years. I've seen things that need to be said. Morrison looked like he'd bitten into something sour. But with the courtroom packed full of watching eyes, he had little choice. Very well, Mr. Garrett approached the bench. You'll be sworn in. And so Pete testified. He spoke clearly and without embellishment about the day he'd been in Silas's study and seen a stack of blank promissory notes. About conversations he'd overheard regarding the need to acquire certain properties before the railroad announcement. About Silas practicing signatures, claiming he was helping illiterate partners with paperwork, but doing it in private, in secret. Harrington tried to discredit him, suggesting he was lying for money or out of spite. But Pete held firm, his simple honesty more convincing than any lawyer's rhetoric. When Pete finished, Samuel Porter requested to speak again, this time presenting his receipts in detail, walking through how they proved his son had paid cash for materials Silas later claimed were borrowed. The evidence was mounting, undeniable and damning. Clara could see Morrison's discomfort growing, could see Silas's facade cracking further. The courtroom was silent, everyone leaning forward, not wanting to miss a single word. Finally, Morrison held up his hand. Enough. I've heard sufficient testimony. He paused, his eyes moving across the packed courtroom, seeming to calculate odds and consequences. This court will take a brief recess to consider all evidence. 30 minutes? He disappeared into his chambers, leaving the courtroom buzzing with speculation. Clara sat down, suddenly exhausted, and felt Jacob's hand on her shoulder. You did well, he said quietly. We all did, she replied. But will it be enough? In 30 minutes, they would have their answer, and Cold Creek would learn whether justice could overcome corruption, or whether power and money would win, as they so often did on the frontier. The 30 minutes stretched like hours. Clara sat in the courtroom, unable to leave, unable to do anything but wait while Morrison deliberated behind closed doors. The crowd remained, no one willing to miss the resolution. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Jacob stood near the window, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his eyes alert, watching Silas and his lawyers huddle in urgent, whispered conversation. Samuel Porter sat beside Clara, his old hands clasped together, perhaps in prayer. Martha had positioned herself near the door, as if ready to spread whatever news emerged to the rest of the town. When Morrison finally returned, the courtroom fell silent so quickly Clara could hear the clock ticking on the wall. I have considered all evidence and testimony, Morrison began, his voice formal and flat. This is an unusual case, with serious allegations made by both sides. The matter of the promissory note versus the journal entries presents a credible dispute. Clara's heart sank. He was preparing to rule for Silas anyway, using the language of legal technicality to justify corruption. However, Morrison continued, and Clara's attention snapped back. The testimony of Mr. Porter and Mr. Garrett, combined with the documentary evidence presented, raises substantial questions about the authenticity of the promissory note. While I cannot rule definitively on matters that may involve criminal fraud, that would be for a higher court or federal authorities, I can rule on the immediate question before me. He paused. And in that pause, Clara saw something flicker in his expression. Fear, perhaps, or the realization that his career was on the line either way he ruled. I find insufficient evidence to support Mr. Trent's claim of debt. The promissory note alone, without corroborating documentation, does not meet the standard of proof required to seize property. Mrs. Dawson's journal, supported by Mr. Porter's receipts showing Mr. Dawson's consistent business practices, creates reasonable doubt about the note's validity. Therefore, I rule in favor of Mrs. Dawson. The debt claim is dismissed. The courtroom erupted. People were on their feet, some cheering, others shouting in shock. Silas Trent's face had gone from red to white, his carefully controlled expression shattering into pure rage. Clara sat frozen, unable to quite believe what she'd heard. She'd won. Thomas's home was safe. The truth had prevailed. Jacob was beside her instantly, his hand on her shoulder, steady and real. You did it, he said quietly. and she heard the pride in his voice. But the celebration was short-lived. Silas was shoving through the crowd, his lawyers forgotten, heading straight for Clara. People backed away from him, sensing the fury radiating from the man. "This isn't over," he snarled, pointing at Clara. "You think you've won? You've destroyed me, dragged my name through the mud, turned my own employees against me. But I built everything in this valley, and I can take it away just as easily. You'll regret this. All of you will regret this." Sheriff Cartwright moved to intervene, but it was Jacob who stepped between Silas and Clara, his presence a wall of calm determination. "You need to leave," Jacob said quietly. "Now, or what?" Silas spat. "You'll assault me again, in front of all these witnesses? Or I'll arrest you," came a new voice from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. A man Clara had never seen before stood in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat that couldn't quite hide the badge pinned to his vest. A U.S. Marshal's badge. The newcomer walked down the aisle with the measured pace of someone used to authority, his boots echoing in the suddenly quiet space. He was, perhaps 45, with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much but still believed in justice. "Marshal William Tate," he announced, pulling papers from his coat. "Federal warrant for the arrest of Silas Trent on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of property through false legal claims. Mr. Trent, you'll need to come with me." Silas staggered back as if physically struck. "This is absurd." "You can't. I haven't. Who sent for you?" "I did," Jacob said quietly. Every eye in the courtroom turned to him. Jacob reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a badge of his own. Worn and old, but unmistakably a U.S. Marshal's badge. Clara's breath caught. "Jacob? My real name is Jacob Holt," he said, speaking to the room but his eyes on Clara, needing her to understand. "But 15 years ago, I was U.S. Marshal Jacob Holt, working out of Helena. I retired after my family was killed by men I'd helped convict. I walked away from the badge, came to these mountains to hide from everything." He turned the badge over in his hands, the gesture almost reverent. 3 weeks ago, when I first heard about Silas's debt claim against Clara, something in me woke up. The old instincts, the old sense of justice. I couldn't let it stand, so I contacted my old office, told them what I suspected, sent them evidence as we gathered it. Samuel's receipts, Pete's testimony, everything. And I asked them to send someone. Marshal Tate nodded. Jacob Holt has never stopped being a marshal in the eyes of the federal government. He took leave, but he never formally resigned. His commission is still active, and his judgment is still trusted. When he sent word about a pattern of fraud in Cold Creek, we took it seriously. I've been investigating for the past 2 weeks, gathering additional evidence from other territories where Silas has done business. He turned to Silas, pulled out iron handcuffs. "Turns out you've been running variations of this scheme across Montana and Idaho for nearly a decade. Different names, different properties, always targeting vulnerable people who couldn't fight back. Until now," Silas was shaking his head, backing away. "You can't prove anything. Those are all legitimate business transactions. We have testimony from 8 other victims," Tate said firmly. "We have handwriting analysis of your forged signatures. We have records of you purchasing blank legal forms in bulk. And we have your own ranch hands willing to testify about your methods in exchange for immunity. Mr. Trent, you're done." The handcuffs clicked shut around Silas's wrists with a sound like finality. He looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of people he'd manipulated and controlled for years, and found no sympathy anywhere. "Judge Morrison," Tate continued, "you'll also need to come with me. Federal prosecutors will want to discuss your role in enabling these frauds." Morrison had gone pale. "I was simply ruling on the cases as presented. You took bribes to expedite hearings and rule in Trent's favor, despite obvious evidence of fraud. We have financial records showing regular payments from Trent to your personal accounts. That's corruption of office, Your Honor. That's a federal crime." Sheriff Cartwright moved forward to assist, his expression grim but not entirely displeased. Perhaps he was relieved that someone with real authority was finally addressing the corruption he'd been powerless to stop. As Silas and Morrison were led out of the courtroom, the crowd began to stir, voices rising in amazement and vindication. Clara sat motionless, her mind trying to process everything that had just happened. Jacob knelt beside her chair, his winter ice eyes searching her face. "I should have told you sooner about who I was, what I'd done. But He hesitated, and she saw the vulnerability there, the fear of losing her trust. "I wasn't sure I had the right to carry that badge again. Wasn't sure I deserved to, after failing to protect my own family." Clara reached out, touched the badge he still held. It was worn smooth from years of carry, the metal warm from his hand. "You protected me," she said softly. "You protected this whole town, even though most of them never knew you were anything more than a mountain hermit. Jacob, you didn't fail. You came back to what you were always meant to be." "I came back because of you," he said. "Because you reminded me that there are things worth fighting for, people worth protecting. A widow who refused to surrender to fear taught me how to be brave again." Martha was suddenly there, pulling Clara to her feet and into a fierce hug. "You did it, girl. You stood up to the most powerful man in the valley, and you won." Samuel Porter clasped Clara's hands, tears running unashamed down his weathered cheeks. "Elizabeth's name is cleared. David's name is cleared. After all these years, the truth is finally known. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for having the courage I couldn't find." "We found it together," Clara said, her own tears flowing now. "All of us. That's what made the difference." Pete Garrett approached, hat in hand. "Mrs. Dawson, I'm still planning to leave the valley. Fresh start somewhere else. But I'm glad I stayed long enough to do the right thing. Your husband, Mr. Thomas, he would have been proud of you. He would have been proud of all of us," Clara said. "Everyone who stood up today, everyone who chose truth over fear. That's what Thomas believed in. That's what he lived by." The celebration continued outside the courthouse, but Clara needed air, needed space to process everything. She slipped out a side door and found herself on the quiet east side of the building, away from the crowds. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, and she could hear the creek running nearby, its sound eternal and peaceful. She pulled Thomas's compass from her pocket, held it in her palm. The needle swung, settled, pointed true north. Always pointing true north, no matter how confused the path might seem. "I wish you could have seen this," she whispered to the memory of her husband. "Wish you could know that your honesty, your integrity, it mattered. It made the difference." Jacob found her there a few minutes later. He'd pinned his marshal's badge back inside his vest, hidden again, but something about him had changed. He stood straighter, moved with more purpose, as if reclaiming his identity had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for 15 years. "Marshal Tate wants to take statements from everyone," he said. "Build the federal case against Silas and Morrison. It'll take most of the rest of the day. And then?" Clara asked. "Then Silas goes to trial in the territorial capital. Morrison too. With the evidence we have, with all the witnesses willing to testify now that it's safe to do so, they'll both be convicted. Silas will spend years in prison. Morrison will never practice law again." "Good," Clara said simply. Then after a pause, "And what about you? Will you stay here, or does being a marshal again mean you have to leave?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "Tate offered me a position. Active duty again, working cases across the territory. It's good work, important work. But—" He turned to face her fully, and she saw the uncertainty there, the question he was afraid to ask. "Clara, I've spent 15 years running from connection, from caring, from anything that could hurt me again. You've shown me that's no way to live. That protecting people, standing for something, that's what gives life meaning. I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay here if you'd want me to stay." Clara felt her heart expand with something that wasn't quite happiness yet, but might grow into it given time. "This town needs a good lawman. Someone honest, someone who knows how to stand up to corruption. And I—" She smiled, the first real smile she'd felt since Thomas died. "I could use a friend who understands grief and courage, and why some fights are worth having." "Just friends?" Jacob asked quietly. "For now," Clara said honestly. "I'm still mourning Thomas, still figuring out who I am without him. But someday, maybe someday, there could be room for more. If you're patient enough to wait. I've waited 15 years for a reason to care again, Jacob said. I can wait a while longer for it to grow into something more. They stood together in the afternoon sunlight, two broken people who'd found in each other the strength to stand against injustice. It wasn't an ending, not yet, but it was a beginning, and that was enough. Marshal Tate found them eventually, apologetic about interrupting, but needing their statements. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the courthouse, telling their stories for the federal record. Samuel Porter gave his testimony about Elizabeth. Pete Garrett detailed everything he'd witnessed. Martha Hayes provided context about Silas's control over the town's economy. And gradually, a picture emerged of corruption so deep and systematic that it shocked even the federal investigators. Other victims came forward too, emboldened by Silas's arrest. The Johnson family sent a telegram from Oregon offering to return and testify. Robert Chen was located in California and agreed to provide a written statement. Even some of Silas's other employees began talking, relieved to be free of the fear that had kept them silent. By the time the sun set over Cold Creek, the case against Silas Trent had become overwhelming. He would die in prison, most likely. Judge Morrison would spend years behind bars. And Cold Creek would have to rebuild its civic institutions with honest people at the helm. Sheriff Cartwright announced that evening that he'd be appointing Jacob Holt as deputy sheriff, with the understanding that Jacob would transition to full sheriff once the town could hold proper elections. The position had been vacant for years. No one had been willing to stand up to Silas's influence. But with Silas gone, the position mattered again. As Clara walked home that evening, she felt the weight of the past months begin to lift. Her house was secure, Thomas's reputation was protected, and Cold Creek had learned something about the cost of silence and the power of truth. Martha walked with her partway, then veered off toward her own home with a wave and a promise to have lunch together soon. Clara continued alone through the familiar streets, seeing them with new eyes. This was her town, her community. She'd fought for it and won. And now she had the chance to help shape what came next. When she reached her small house, she found Jacob waiting on her porch, a gift in his hands. It was a small carved bird, crafted from pine and sanded smooth, its wings spread as if in flight. "Made this for you," he said, almost shy. "Figured you might like something to remind you that you're free now. Free from Silas's threats, free from fear. Free to decide what comes next in your life." Clara took the bird carefully, ran her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful." Thank you." She invited him in for coffee, and they sat at her small kitchen table talking until late, about the town, about justice, about the future. It was comfortable, companionable, the conversation of two people who'd been through fire together and come out stronger. When Jacob finally left for his mountain cabin, Clara placed the carved bird on her windowsill, where the morning sun would catch it. Beside it, she set Thomas's compass and Samuel's bullet-scarred Bible, three artifacts representing freedom, truth, and faith. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town would need healing. Silas's victims would need support. The vacant judge's seat would need filling. The sheriff's office needed rebuilding. And there would be endless testimonies and legal proceedings as the federal case moved forward. But tonight, Clara Dawson was simply grateful. Grateful for friends who'd stood beside her. Grateful for her own courage that she hadn't known she possessed. Grateful for a future that was hers to shape. Not something imposed by powerful men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. She touched Thomas's wedding ring on her finger, the simple gold band that represented a love that still mattered, that still guided her. "We did it," she whispered. "We protected what you built, protected your memory," and somewhere in the mountains, a reclusive man who'd found his purpose again looked down at the lights of Cold Creek and felt, for the first time in 15 years, that he belonged somewhere, that he mattered. That the badge he'd once carried with pride could be carried with pride again. Justice had come to Cold Creek, brought not by distant authorities or powerful institutions, but by ordinary people who decided that enough was enough. A widow, a mountain man, an old rancher, a shopkeeper, a ranch hand, unlikely heroes, every one of them. But that's how justice often works on the frontier. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through ordinary courage, persistent truth-telling, and the simple refusal to let fear win. And Cold Creek would remember. For years to come, people would tell the story of how Clara Dawson stood up to Silas Trent, how a mountain hermit turned out to be a federal marshal, how a corrupt empire fell because people finally found their voices. It would become legend the way these stories do. But for those who lived it, it was simply the day they remembered who they were and what they stood for. And that was enough. But peace, Clara discovered, was not the same as safety. 3 days after Silas's arrest, she woke to find a note slid under her door. The paper was expensive, the handwriting elegant, clearly not Silas's own hand, but the message was unmistakably from him. "You think this is over. You think I'm finished. But I have resources you can't imagine, friends in places you've never heard of. Federal marshals can be bribed, witnesses can be silenced. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." "It won't." Clara showed the note to Jacob immediately. He was in the process of moving his essential belongings from the mountain cabin into a room above the sheriff's office, accepting his new role as deputy. His face went hard as stone when he read Silas's words. "He's in federal custody," Jacob said. "How did he get this to you?" Clara saw the fierce determination in his eyes, the old guilt driving him to keep this promise. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain her independence, to prove she could handle this alone. But another part, the practical, survival-focused part that had kept her alive on the frontier, knew that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. "All right," she said. "Stay, and thank you." That night, with Jacob sleeping in her front room, Clara rested better than she had in days. But her relief was short-lived. Marshal Tate arrived in Cold Creek 3 days later with grim news. Silas Trent posted bail, he announced at an emergency meeting in Sheriff Cartwright's office. Federal magistrate in the territorial capital set it at $10,000, figuring no one could raise that kind of money. But Silas had assets hidden away, property in other territories, investments under false names. "He made bail this morning and disappeared before we could stop him." The room went silent. Clara felt her blood turn to ice. "Disappeared how?" Jacob demanded. "He's facing federal charges." "Where could he go?" "Canada, most likely, or Mexico. Somewhere outside U.S. jurisdiction where he can't be extradited." Tate looked at Clara with genuine concern. "Mrs. Dawson, I won't lie to you. Silas Trent is a man with nothing left to lose. His reputation is destroyed, his empire is crumbling, and he knows he's facing decades in prison if caught. That makes him extremely dangerous. He's already demonstrated he's willing to intimidate witnesses. I have to assume he'll escalate." "You think he'll come back here?" Clara said quietly. "I think it's likely. He views you as the source of his downfall. If he can silence you, prevent you from testifying at trial, he might convince himself he can still salvage something. It's irrational, but cornered men often are." Jacob was already moving, checking his pistol, loading extra ammunition. "Then we need to protect Clara, round-the-clock guard, armed escorts, whatever it takes." "I can assign 2 federal deputies," Tate said. "But honestly, Mr. Holt, there's only so much protection we can provide in a town this remote. If Silas comes with hired guns, if he's determined enough," he didn't finish the sentence. "He didn't need to. Then we end this," Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "We don't wait for Silas to come to us. We find him first. That's law enforcement's job," Tate protested. "Mrs. Dawson, you're a civilian witness. You need to stay safe while you what? Search the entire Montana Territory? He could be anywhere, and every day he's free is another day I'm in danger, another day this whole town is in danger." Clara stood, moved to the map pinned to Cartwright's wall. "Silas built his empire in this valley. He knows every trail, every hiding place, every person who might shelter him. If he's planning something, he's planning it close. Probably watching us right now." "She's right," Samuel Porter said from the doorway. No one had heard him enter, But there he stood, old and tired, but with the same determination that had made him testify. Silas wouldn't run far. He's too arrogant, too convinced he can still fix this. My money says he's at one of his line shacks up in the high country. Place where he can watch the town, plan his next move. You know where these line shacks are? Jacob asked. Some of them. I ran cattle in those mountains for 40 years before Silas squeezed me out. There are maybe a dozen shelters scattered through the high valleys, places Silas's men use during roundup season. Most are abandoned this time of year. Jacob studied the map with the intensity of someone planning a military campaign. If we can narrow it down to the most likely locations, we could scout them. Find out where he's hiding. That's vigilante justice, Tate warned. I can't officially sanction, then unofficially turn a blind eye, Jacob said flatly. Because officially, your best option is to wait and hope Silas makes a mistake. And while we're waiting, he could strike at any time, hurt any number of people. I'm not willing to accept that risk. Tate was silent for a long moment, his internal conflict visible. Finally, he sighed. If a local deputy, acting on information from a concerned citizen, happened to scout some remote property, looking for signs of trespassers, I suppose I couldn't stop him. And if that deputy found evidence of Silas Trent's location, well, then I'd have cause to bring in federal support for an arrest. It wasn't explicit approval, but it was as close as they were going to get. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Samuel marked the locations of 6 line shacks on the map, remote cabins where Silas's ranch hands stayed during cattle drives. Jacob and Sheriff Cartwright divided them up, planning routes that would let them scout all 6 locations over the next 2 days. I'm coming with you, Clara said. Absolutely not, Jacob and Ben replied in unison. Listen to me, Clara insisted. Silas is doing this because of me. I won't hide in town while other people risk their lives to keep me safe. And besides, she pulled out a rifle, the one Thomas had taught her to shoot years ago, for protection against mountain lions and bears. I can handle myself. I'm a better shot than half the men in this town. It's not about shooting, Jacob said, his voice rough with worry. It's about keeping you out of harm's way. Jacob Holt, you don't get to make that choice for me. Clara met his eyes steadily. I'm going. You can take me with you voluntarily, or I'll follow on my own. But either way, I'm not staying behind. Martha stepped forward. Then I'm coming too. Extra eyes, extra hands. And before you argue, she held up a hand to forestall protests. I've lived through 2 husbands dying, a prairie fire that took my first home, and a grizzly attack that left me with these scars. She rolled up her sleeve, showing the white marks on her forearm. I can handle a rifle and I don't panic. You need people you can trust. That's me. Jacob looked at Sheriff Cartwright, who shrugged. And they're both adults, both capable. And honestly, Jacob, we need every able body we can get. If Silas has hired guns with him, and he probably does, we're already outnumbered. So it was decided. They would leave at dawn, split into 2 groups. Jacob, Clara, and Samuel would take the northern route, checking 3 line shacks in the high valleys. Sheriff Cartwright, Martha, and 2 deputies would take the southern route. They'd regroup by nightfall and decide next steps based on what they found. That night, Clara prepared carefully. She packed food, water, ammunition. She wore practical clothes, wool pants borrowed from Martha, sturdy boots, a warm jacket. She braided her hair tightly and tied it back out of her face. This wasn't a social call. This was preparation for battle, and she would be ready. Jacob watched her preparations with a mixture of pride and worry. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. No one would think less of you for staying safe. I would think less of me, Clara replied. Jacob, my whole life, I've let other people handle the difficult things. My father protected me until he died. Thomas protected me after that. Even you've been protecting me these past months. But this fight, this is mine. Silas came after me, threatened me, tried to steal what Thomas and I built together. I need to see this through to the end, not hide while others finish it for me. Your courage is going to give me gray hair, Jacob said. But there was warmth in his voice. Respect. You already have gray hair, Clara pointed out with a small smile. Then premature death from worry, he amended. Clara, I need you to promise me something. If things go bad tomorrow, if we find Silas and they're shooting, you get to cover and you stay there. Don't try to be a hero. Just survive. Only if you promise the same, Clara said. I can't. I'm a lawman. It's my job to stand between civilians and danger. Then we're at an impasse. Because I'm not promising something you won't promise yourself. Clara checked her rifle one last time, set it by the door ready for morning. We'll both do our best to stay safe, and we'll both do what needs to be done. That's all either of us can promise. They sat together in her small parlor, watching the fire burn low, neither wanting to sleep, but both needing rest for what tomorrow would bring. At some point, Clara's head drifted to Jacob's shoulder, and his arm came around her, steady and protective. Whatever happens, Jacob said into the quiet darkness, I want you to know, these past months with you, they've meant everything to me. You brought me back to life, Clara, gave me purpose again. No matter how tomorrow goes, I'm grateful for that. Don't talk like you're saying goodbye, Clara murmured. We're both going to survive this. We're going to see Silas arrested, see him tried and convicted, and then we're going to rebuild this town into something better. Together, Jacob agreed softly. I like the sound of that. They did sleep eventually, exhaustion overcoming anxiety. But Clara's dreams were troubled, full of shadows and pursuit, of running through dark forests with danger, always one step behind. She woke before dawn to find Jacob already up, making coffee, checking weapons and supplies. The marshal's warrant book he'd used to help build the case against Silas sat on her kitchen table, a leather-bound reminder of justice not yet fully served. Ready? Jacob asked, as the first light of dawn began to color the eastern sky. Clara touched Thomas's compass in her pocket, felt its reassuring weight. True north, the right path, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Ready? She said. They met Samuel at the edge of town. The old rancher looked grim, but determined, carrying a rifle that had seen decades of use and a resolve that had only recently been rediscovered. My son would have done this, Samuel said, as they began riding up into the mountains. David would have hunted Silas down to protect Elizabeth and their boy. Since David can't, I will. It's past time this family stopped being victims. The trail up was steep and treacherous, made worse by overnight rain that had turned sections to mud. They rode in silence, saving their breath for the climb, eyes constantly scanning the forest around them for any sign of ambush. The first line shack was empty, obviously unused for months. The second showed signs of recent occupation, fresh ashes in the fireplace, supplies neatly stored, but no people. At the third, high in a valley where snow still lingered in the shadows, despite the late spring warmth, they found what they were looking for. 2 horses tied outside, smoke rising from the chimney. And through the window, visible for just a moment, the distinctive silhouette of Silas Trent. Jacob held up a hand, signaling them to stop. They dismounted quietly, tied their horses far enough away that they wouldn't give warning, and approached on foot. He's not alone, Clara whispered, spotting a second figure moving inside. At least one other person, maybe more. We need to get closer, Jacob said. See how many we're dealing with before we make a move. They split up, Jacob circling to approach from the north, Samuel from the south, Clara staying in the tree line with clear sight of the cabin's entrance. The minutes stretched like hours as they positioned themselves. Then Jacob signaled, 4 fingers. 4 people inside the cabin, all armed. Silas and 3 hired guns against the 3 of them. Not ideal odds, but they'd faced worse. At least they had surprise on their side. Jacob stepped out from cover, his voice carrying across the clearing. Silas Trent, this is Deputy Marshal Jacob Holt. You're under federal arrest. Come out with your hands up. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cabin door burst open and gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the morning air, splintering trees, kicking up dirt. Clara dove behind a fallen log as Samuel returned fire from his position. Jacob had taken cover behind a boulder, his own shots measured and precise. This was it, Clara realized. The confrontation she'd been building toward since the moment Silas grabbed her arm at Jacob's mountain cabin. This was the moment that would decide everything. whether justice prevailed or power won, whether courage mattered or fear ruled. She steadied her rifle on the log, sighted carefully like Thomas had taught her, and prepared to fight for her life and her freedom. The climax was here, and there would be no turning back. The gunfight lasted less than a minute, but it felt like eternity. Clara fired twice at movement in the cabin doorway, her shots forcing one of Silas's men back inside. Samuel's old rifle cracked steadily from his position, pinning down whoever was at the window. Jacob's shots were precise, calculated. He wasn't trying to kill, Clara realized, but to contain, to prevent escape. Then, as suddenly as it started, the firing stopped. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the ringing in Clara's ears and her own ragged breathing. "Silas!" Jacob called out. "You're surrounded. Federal marshals are on their way. Surrender now and you might live through this." It was a bluff. The marshals were at least an hour behind them, but Silas didn't know that. "Go to hell, Holt!" Silas's voice came from inside the cabin, thick with rage and something else, desperation, maybe, or the realization that his options had run out. "You've ruined everything. Everything I built, everything I worked for. Because of her." The venom in the word made Clara's skin crawl. Because of that widow. Because she couldn't just accept what was inevitable. What was inevitable? Clara called back, surprising herself. "You stealing my home?" "My husband's memory." "Was that inevitable, Silas? Or was it just greed?" "It was business," Silas shouted. "Just business. The railroad is coming through, and I was going to be positioned to profit from it. That's how the world works, Clara. The strong take what they need, and the weak get out of the way. You should have gotten out of the way. Thomas never taught me to get out of the way of bullies," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "He taught me to stand up for what's right." A different voice came from the cabin, one of the hired guns. "Boss, this is crazy. We signed on to scare some people, not get into a shootout with federal law." "I'm done. I'm coming out." The door cracked open, and a man Clara didn't recognize emerged with his hands raised high, his gun belt already unbuckled and dropping to the ground. Jacob covered him as he walked forward, hands never wavering. "On your knees, hands behind your head." The man complied immediately, clearly wanting no part of what was about to happen. A second man followed, then a third, until it was just Silas alone in the cabin. Jacob handcuffed each man efficiently and had Samuel guard them while he refocused on the cabin. "Silas, you're alone now. Your men have surrendered. This can end peacefully if you let it." The response was a single gunshot from inside the cabin, but not aimed at them. Clara heard glass breaking, Silas shooting out the back window. Then came the sound of boots hitting the ground and running. "He's making a break for it," Samuel shouted. Jacob was already moving, circling the cabin at a run. Clara followed without thinking, her rifle ready. They rounded the corner in time to see Silas disappearing into the tree line, heading upslope toward the higher elevations. "Stay here," Jacob ordered, but Clara ignored him. She'd meant what she said. This was her fight, and she was seeing it through. The chase led them higher into the mountains, through dense pine forest and across rocky clearings where patches of snow still lingered. Silas was ahead of them, crashing through undergrowth with the desperation of a man who knew this was his last chance. Behind them, Clara could hear Samuel's labored breathing as the old rancher struggled to keep up. They broke through the tree line into a high alpine meadow, and that's where Silas made his stand. He'd taken cover behind a cluster of boulders. His pistol trained on the trail they'd have to cross to reach him. "That's far enough," he shouted. His face was red, his breathing harsh. The veneer of civilization had completely stripped away, leaving only the raw desperation of a cornered animal. "I'll shoot the first person who takes another step." Jacob raised his hand, signaling Clara and Samuel to stop. "Silas, this is done. You can't escape. The smart thing, the only thing, is to surrender." "Surrender to what?" "A show trial. Years in federal prison. My name dragged through every newspaper from here to Washington." Silas laughed, the sound unhinged. "I built an empire, Holt. I was going to be the most powerful man in Montana Territory. And she," he pointed his pistol at Clara, "she destroyed it all. Because she wouldn't bow down, wouldn't accept her place. My place, Clara said quietly, stepping forward despite Jacob's warning hand on her arm, was never under your boot. Silas, my place was beside a good man who taught me that honesty matters more than wealth. You could have had a place in Cold Creek too, a respected place, earned through fair dealing and decent behavior. But you chose power over respect, fear over friendship. And now you have neither. Silas's hand was shaking, the pistol wavering. You think you've won? You'd think because you stood up to me, because you got lucky with some witnesses and a federal marshal, that means something. It doesn't. The world doesn't change because of one woman's stubbornness. Maybe not the whole world, Clara agreed. But Cold Creek changed. The people there saw what you really were, and they chose differently. They chose truth over fear. That's worth more than any empire you could have built on lies. Touching, Silas spat. But it doesn't matter. None of it matters now. You've taken everything from me, so I've got nothing left to lose. And if I'm going down... His pistol steadied, aimed directly at Clara's chest. Jacob moved with the speed Clara had seen once before, stepping between her and the gun, just as Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot echoed across the meadow, impossibly loud in the mountain silence. Jacob staggered, his hand going to his shoulder, where blood was already blooming through his shirt. But he didn't fall. His own pistol came up, steady despite the wound, and fired once. Silas dropped his weapon, clutching his leg where Jacob's bullet had struck. He went down hard, crying out in pain and rage and the bitter disappointment of final defeat. Clara was at Jacob's side instantly, her hands pressing against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You idiot," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You promised me you'd stay safe." "I promised to protect you," Jacob corrected, his voice tight with pain but steady. "That's what I did." "Worth it." Samuel was already scrambling down to secure Silas, checking the man's leg wound with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd treated plenty of ranch injuries over the years. "He'll live," Samuel announced. "Bullet went through the muscle, missed the bone. He'll have a limp to remember this day by, but he'll live to stand trial." Jacob's wound was worse. The bullet had gone through his shoulder, missing vital arteries but causing significant damage. Clara used her neckerchief to pack the wound, her hands remembering the basic medical knowledge every frontier woman learned. "You need a doctor," she said. "Town's an hour away," Jacob replied. "I'll make it." Done worse with worse. They fashioned a litter from branches and Clara's coat to carry Silas down the mountain. The man had gone silent, perhaps finally understanding that his empire was truly finished. His hired guns, still under Samuel's guard back at the cabin, helped carry their former employer without complaint. The ride back to Cold Creek was slow and painful. Jacob remained upright in his saddle through sheer will, his face gray with blood loss, but his posture proud. Clara rode beside him, ready to catch him if he faltered. They reached town as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The main street was crowded. Word of the confrontation had spread, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to see the resolution. Marshal Tate was there with his federal deputies, taking custody of Silas and his men with grim satisfaction. "Got my message to stay back, I see," he said dryly to Jacob. "Didn't want to wait," Jacob replied. "Besides, we handled it. I can see that. You're bleeding all over my jurisdiction." But Tate's voice held respect, even approval. "Get yourself to the doctor. I'll handle the paperwork." Doc Morrison, no relation to the corrupt judge, met them at his clinic. He was a younger man, recently arrived in Cold Creek, with modern medical training and a steady hand. He examined Jacob's shoulder, cleaned and dressed the wound, and delivered his verdict. "You're lucky. Another inch to the right, and the bullet would have clipped your subclavian artery. You'd have bled out before reaching town." He finished bandaging Jacob's shoulder with practiced efficiency. "You'll heal, but it'll take time. No heavy lifting, no riding hard, and for God's sake, no more gunfights for at least 6 weeks. Can't promise that last part," Jacob said with a hint of his old humor. "Comes with the badge." Clara sat beside him through the entire examination, her hand finding his and holding tight. When the doctor left them alone, she finally let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. "You could have died," she said quietly. "You could have died saving me." "Would have been a good death," Jacob replied. "Best kind there is. Dying to protect someone you—" He stopped, the words catching. "Someone you care about." Clara heard what he hadn't said, the feeling he'd stopped himself from expressing. And she realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that she felt it too. Not love, not yet. She was still grieving Thomas, still learning who she was without him. But the beginning of something, the seed of a feeling that might, given time, grow into love. "Don't die," she said simply. "Not for me, not for anyone. Just live, Jacob. Live and help me rebuild Cold Creek into something better. That's what I need from you." "Then that's what I'll do," he promised. Silas Trent was held in federal custody, his leg wound treated and his bail revoked. Judge Morrison had already been transferred to the territorial capital to await trial. The corrupt system they'd built was dismantled piece by piece, replaced by honest people committed to real justice. The trial, when it finally happened 3 months later, was almost anticlimactic. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses numerous and credible. Silas was convicted on 14 counts of fraud, 3 counts of attempted intimidation of witnesses, and 1 count of assault with a deadly weapon. Judge Morrison received a similar sentence. Both men were sent to federal prison. Silas would be elderly before he was eligible for parole. Morrison would likely die behind bars. Cold Creek, freed from their corrupt influence, began to heal. New elections were held for judge and sheriff. Jacob, his shoulder fully healed, won the sheriff's position with near-unanimous support. A circuit judge from the territorial capital agreed to serve Cold Creek until a permanent, honest replacement could be found. The railroad did come through 2 years later, bringing prosperity and change. But this time, the profits were distributed fairly, opportunities shared among all the town's residents rather than hoarded by one powerful man. Clara's property, sitting right on the railway line, became valuable exactly as Silas had predicted. But Clara didn't sell it to the railroad company. Instead, she donated a portion for the station depot and leased the rest at fair market rates, using the income to establish a fund for widows and families in need. The people Silas had victimized, now given a chance to rebuild. Samuel Porter's name was cleared, and Elizabeth finally received an official apology from the territorial government, along with compensation for the property that had been stolen from her. She wrote to Clara a long letter full of gratitude and tears, saying that even though she couldn't return to Montana, knowing the truth was finally known meant everything. The carved wooden bird Jacob had given Clara remained on her windowsill, joined now by other gifts: a pressed flower from Martha, a horseshoe from Samuel, a badge of appreciation from the town council. Each one represented a connection, a friendship forged in fire and strengthened by shared struggle. And on Clara's finger, Thomas's wedding ring remained, still catching the light, still reminding her of a love that had shaped who she was. But beside it now, she sometimes imagined there might someday be room for another ring. Not yet, not while the grief was still fresh and the memory still so precious. But someday, because life, Clara had learned, wasn't about choosing between past and future, between grief and hope. It was about holding both, honoring what you'd lost while remaining open to what might come. It was about finding strength in vulnerability, courage in fear, and justice in the simple act of standing up and saying, "No more." As the sun set over Cold Creek one evening, painting the mountains in their eternal beauty, Clara sat on her porch with Jacob beside her. His arm was still in a sling, healing slowly but surely. They watched the town settling into night, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace, real peace. Not the fragile peace of before, built on fear and silence, but the solid peace of a battle fought and won, of truth honored and justice served. "You thinking about what comes next?" Jacob asked quietly. "Always," Clara replied with a small smile. "But for now, I'm content with what is. A safe home, good friends, a community healing from old wounds. That's enough for today. Tomorrow, Jacob ventured. Tomorrow we'll see, Clara said. But whatever comes, we'll face it together. And in the gathering darkness, with the mountains standing watch and the stars beginning to emerge, that was more than enough. It was everything.